My name is Grace Peng, and I chair the Interagency Modeling and Analysis Group, and I am very happy to introduce the moderators for Theme 3 for the multiscale modeling for medical devices. But I just wanted to have you take a look at this agenda really quickly. We're having our consortium discussion after the refreshments, after Theme 3, and then we're actually going to be posed to take a picture at around noon, so if you all can stay in the room at that time. This afternoon we have our keynote address from Dr. Subir Suresh, and then our Theme 4 stakeholder perspectives. And finally, at the end of the day, we will have our table chats and discussions with IMAG representatives, and finally our 2 group dinners. So please welcome Donna Lochner from the FDA and Andrew Rossi from the National Institute of Mental Health.
Good morning. So it's my pleasure to start off today's session number 3, which is multiscale modeling for medical devices. And we have 3 speakers this morning. Each speaker will have 20 minutes, same as the session yesterday. And the lights here on the podium for the speakers mean the same thing. Green means you can keep talking, yellow means you have 2 minutes, and red means please leave time for the next speaker. So it's my pleasure to introduce Adam Himes, who is our first speaker this morning. Adam is a mechanical engineer in the Cardiac Rhythm and Heart Failure Division at Medtronic. His primary area of focus is in the use of engineering and statistical models for predicting and analyzing medical device reliability and performance. Since coming to Medtronic in 2009, Adam has worked in both in vitro bench tests, medical imaging, and computational models to understand the problems ranging from fatigue fracture to tribology of insulation materials. If you're like me and you're not a mechanical engineer, tribology is a branch of mechanical engineering that characterizes the properties of interacting surfaces that are in relative motion, so things like friction, lubrication, and wear. Adam received his bachelor's in mechanical engineering from Michigan Tech and his master's in mechanical engineering from the University of Minnesota. The title of his talk today is Incorporating Virtual Patients into Clinical Studies. Adam.
Morning, everyone. I'm here on behalf of my co-authors and colleagues from the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. Just a quick introduction if you haven't heard of MDIC. It's a public-private partnership that gives people from industry, FDA, as well as nonprofits a way to work together in what's called the pre-competitive space. So we can talk about ideas addressing regulatory science in a way that really doesn't affect competitiveness, and it's been a great venue. So we're going to talk about virtual patients, what the idea is there, and how to incorporate them into medical device clinical trials. I'll talk about the motivation for this work. I'll introduce what a virtual patient is, what we mean by when we say virtual patient, how that's different than a computer simulation that you might be thinking of. Get a little bit into the statistics of how you incorporate virtual patients into a clinical study. Pardon me. Then talk about how we took this idea for a test drive with a mock submission, which is really just like it sounds. We had a fictitious device that we went through in the IDE submission process. The motivation for this work is probably more apparent to the people in this room than most, and it really comes from 2 different areas. On one hand, the global demand for clinical evidence has really never been higher. If you think about the needs for a value-based healthcare system, you really need to know a lot more about the therapies and devices that you're bringing to market. There's a lot more patients, certainly more markets, a lot of reasons why these costs have been escalating at a rate that's really unsustainable. On the other side, there's been advances in modeling that are really breathtaking, and our ability to directly simulate clinical outcomes has never been better. So we have a need in the form of a demand for evidence. We have a solution in the form of being able to simulate clinical outcomes, but there really hasn't been a way to bring these together. And if you look at how we design clinical studies, you can see that by and large, the design of a clinical trial is the same now as it was 10, 20, or 30 years ago. So we really haven't been able to bring the modeling advances with the need together yet. So we're introducing the notion of virtual patients as a new source of evidence. If you go and look at what are the evidence sources that come with a traditional application, there'll be some bench testing, some animal studies, and finally human clinical evidence. The slice of computer modeling is growing certainly steadily, and that's an important part for the future. But when you can directly simulate a clinical outcome, now you can start to talk about a virtual patient. And that's what this work involved. We're going to go into the statistical methodology because there does have to be some math behind it, actually, how you can take those virtual outcomes and incorporate it with the rest of the human clinical evidence. So at a high level, what makes a virtual patient, and how might this be different than a traditional simulation? It's really the combination of the physical modeling along with probabilistic, or you could think population-based modeling. And the really key thing is that it's got to point to a clinically relevant outcome. So let's talk about each one of those pillars a little bit. By physical modeling, that's all the things that you're seeing on the posters out there. So you've got some kind of therapy that you're modeling, or maybe it's reliability or safety of a device. It could be biological response to a system if you're thinking about something like some of the advanced diabetes management solutions. The next step is taking that to a population, and that's where the probabilistic modeling comes in. One of the advantages of a clinical study is that you can go and sample directly from your population. You don't even need to know what all the sources of variability are because you're sampling, and that's why you run a clinical study, so you can characterize that. When you're simulating a virtual patient cohort, now there's a little bit more statistical work involved to make sure that the inputs are reflecting the variability as well as the uncertainty of your underlying patient population. So the statisticians and engineers are starting to have to work together in a way that they haven't before. And as I mentioned before, the really key thing for virtual patient models in this framework is that they have to be simulating something that's going to be measured in a clinical study. And really specifically, if you go on to clinicaltrials.gov, for example, and look up any number of clinical studies, there's going to be objectives for the trial. There'll be endpoints like minimizing hospitalization or blood pressure management or something safety like freedom from fracture of a device. Your virtual patient model has to simulate the same thing that's going to be measured in the clinical study. And that's how you can make that match and how you can actually have some impact on the clinical study. So let's make things a little bit more specific and talk about an example of virtual patient modeling. It always helps to have something you can kind of put your mind around. So there certainly are a lot of applications that we could have discussed. Lead fracture, so a defibrillator lead is like a wire that connects a pulse generator to somewhere in the heart. And when there's a dangerous rhythm that's detected, the defibrillator will deliver a shock that hopefully restores a normal rhythm to the heart. When the lead fractures, obviously that has potentially life-threatening consequences. So it's a very relevant failure mode. There's been a couple of pretty high-profile product recalls in the past where the fracture rate has been too high. So there's patients that have had devices and they've had to have the experience of getting a letter in the mail saying your device is recalled. So it's certainly a definite clinical need. And finally, for the purposes of this example and this discussion, there's some public domain examples. So we can go and look in the literature, and these models have been developed in papers that we can go and reference, so we don't need to talk about any particular manufacturer's device. Let's get into a little detail about how this model works. Won't dive way under the hood as much. I know this is a great audience to do that. But talking about the inputs and how this kind of makes a virtual patient cohort. If you think about a lead, it's essentially a wire that exists somewhere inside your anatomy. And like any kind of wire, if you think about a pile of paper clips on your desk, if you bend it really tight and you bend it enough times, it's going to fracture. So the inputs that we need follow those things exactly. We can go and do imaging and see how much bending happens in vivo. And so this is something as straightforward as chest x-rays or fluoroscopic sequences of patients that have had defibrillator leads implanted. They go about arm movements, our activities of daily living. We see how much the lead bends, and that gives us a distribution for how much curvature the lead has. The next place we go to is activity. So you can bend something really tight, but now you got to bend it a lot of times. And so you go to the kinesiological literature, and you get population parameters for how many times a day people move their arms. So another statistical input. And then the final part is the fatigue strength. And this can come from simulations, looking at stress and strain within the defibrillator lead, or bench testing. Again, you've got some kind of statistical model here saying if you have a certain amount of applied bending applied to the lead and it happens a certain number of times, what is the probability of fracture after a certain number of years? So you can kind of get your head around here how now you can simulate on a patient-by-patient basis what their experience is going to be for this particular failure mode. You do that many, many times and you can get a survival curve. And then you repeat the process, and now you have a cohort of survival curves, and you're reflecting both the variability in the population as well as your uncertainty associated with those population metrics. So this is actually an example of a virtual patient model that's simulating something that would actually be measured in a clinical study. There's a couple of trials that are registered right now that are collecting exactly this kind of information. So they would, if this approach would have been available when it was designed, they could have augmented their studies using exactly this sort of data. Now that you have an idea of what a virtual patient model looks like, the next step is, what are the statistical methods where you incorporate these outcomes actually into the design of a clinical study? And just for my own curiosity, can I get a show of hands of all the statisticians in the room? So I'm not raising my hand either. So this is something that's probably going to be very new for a lot of engineers. Typically, the engineers will work really hard on designing something. They might do some simulations, understand the underlying reliability, but they don't need to spend a lot of time talking to the statisticians that are designing the clinical study. And vice versa, the people designing the clinical study oftentimes don't need to understand a lot of the inputs to the engineering model. So we have this new intersection. I'm going to talk a little bit about Bayesian statistical methods. At a really high level, what Bayesian methods allow you to do is incorporate prior information into the analysis of your current clinical study or whatever the statistical problem at hand is. So this is obviously very powerful, but there's a couple of challenges that come to mind right away, and they really have to do with how this prior data is influencing your analysis of the current study. The first thing that comes up is there's some decisions that have to be made about how much influence are you going to allow this prior data to have. If you have a virtual patient model, you don't want it to be so influential that the clinical data actually doesn't matter at all. Likewise, you'd like it to have enough influence so that you can gain some efficiencies in the study. So there's definitely a balancing act there. The second thing that comes to mind is what happens if the clinical study disagrees with the virtual patient model? At best, this could be awkward, and at worst, there could really be some bad consequences where you might have a really optimistic virtual patient simulation, but the clinical study is telling you something different. So you need a way to manage that. The solution, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes in more detail, it was developed by the Medical Device Innovation Consortium working group that was actually focused on how to incorporate bench and simulation data into a clinical study. At a really high level, the underlying theme of the method is that you let the agreement between the clinical data and the virtual patient data determine how much weight the virtual patients get. And we'll unpack that and talk through that in a little ways. But this allows you to address the concerns that typically come to mind with a Bayesian prior. So it's a really powerful way to bring your virtual patient data to bear while still giving you some measure of protection. The key part of this method is using what's called a discount function. It's described in a lot more detail in our publication, which actually went live yesterday in its final form. So the timing is really good for this. Hopefully you're all taking pictures and going off and citing this now. But you actually have a function, we're calling it the discount function, where you let the statistical agreement between virtual patients and real patients determine how much weight it has. So you can see a couple of examples in the figure there. And the shape of that function determines how conservative you are in terms of that agreement. So in the case of a less conservative function, you might keep the virtual patient weight until you start to see a really strong evidence of disagreement. On the flip side, maybe you have a really well-validated model, and so you're willing to live with less statistical agreement. That measure of statistical agreement can be something as simple as a t-test between your two groups, or various other sorts of stochastic comparisons. The thing to remember, though, is that when the virtual and the real patients disagree, you're eventually converting to a traditional clinical study. So this really gives you a lot of protection in the case that as the statisticians say that your virtual patient model is misspecified. When they agree, then you get the chance to stop early, enroll fewer patients, and it can give you some nice power measures. So let's talk about this one more time, step by step, to kind of give you an understanding. There's really three things that are new to the clinical design process here. First is comparing the virtual patient data and your current data. The second thing is letting your statistical comparison drive how much weight you have, and that's where you compute the value of the discount function. And once you have the weight amount for your virtual patients, then you combine them. And depending on the statistical model, it can literally be as simple as the equation there, where you've got your current patients, some sort of discount factor times the number of virtual patients you have available. And now you've got your total population. And because you're simulating the same thing that's actually measured in the clinical trial, you can go and do the statistical analysis just like you would otherwise. So this really fits in nicely to a lot of the analysis methods that are already in place. I mentioned earlier that we took this for a test drive using a mock submission, and this is something that was sponsored by MDIC, and we got a lot of really great engagement from the FDA Division of Cardiovascular Devices in the form of an actual review team. The purpose of this mock submission was to get an idea from both the sponsor side and the regulatory side, what are the considerations and questions that are going to come to play when we actually go forward with this sort of clinical study design. We followed the standard pre-submission process, sending things from the sponsor perspective to the legendary FDA mailroom, where the review team looked at it. We had pre-submission correspondence. All of the correspondence, the pre-submission slides, meeting memos, and so forth are eventually going to end up into a publication. For now, they're archived on the MDIC website, so they're publicly available. The real benefit here is across the medical device industry and the medical device regulatory side. Oh, I think I pressed too many buttons. A couple of details about what this mock submission looked like so you can kind of get your head around it. We had a hypothetical new ICD lead, so we kind of took an amalgam of the defibrillator leads that are on the market. This wasn't meant to represent any one manufacturer's device. And we introduced some plausible changes by changing some things about the insulation, some things about the material. These are changes that actually might happen to a particular device and would probably require some level of clinical evaluation. We designed a hypothetical study where you can go and look at the data starting after 200 patients, and then based on the agreement between real and virtual patients, you can make some decisions about enrollment. And then we analyzed it using a traditional design with no virtual patients, what's called a fixed prior, where you get to keep the virtual patients regardless of what you see, and then we looked at a couple of discount functions. So let's talk a little bit about the results of this study, which were really interesting and informative. By the way, each one of the dots right there on there is the result of about 8,000 simulations of the virtual patient model and the clinical study. So when you think of where all the high-performance computing is, if you visit the clinical statisticians, there is an awful lot of computations that go into this sort of study. So it's simple curves, and as is often the case, underneath them is many, many hours of modeling. So let's talk about the different sorts of studies that we looked at here. The traditional design, which would be sort of the status quo at this point, ended up being way underpowered. What that means is that if without any sort of virtual patients to augment the study, the chance of passing the trial, even if the true underlying performance of the device was acceptable, was low, and a sponsor would likely not take up that sort of study, and you'd have to enroll more patients, which would increase costs. On the other side, if you were to do what's referred to as a traditional Bayesian design, where you have a fixed prior and you'd keep your virtual patients regardless of what you saw, in that case, the type 1 error is unacceptably high. Type 1 error is the chance that you pass the study even though the true underlying performance rate is unacceptable. So a 25% chance of a type 1 error is something that no sponsor and no regulator would really be interested in. That's way too high of a chance of introducing a dangerous device to the market. But you can see by using the discount functions, where you get to keep the virtual patients when there's good agreement, and you lose the virtual patients when there's disagreement, that allows you to maintain acceptable power while still protecting the type 1 error. So it shows really good performance characteristics. So where we're at now is we've got a way to specify what a virtual patient should look like. We've got a statistical method to incorporate virtual patients into the study, and we've got great performance characteristics that show that this is actually something that's feasible. So we certainly learned some things along the way. The process started in about 2014, so it was about 2.5 years or so from start to finish. We wrapped up the last of the mock submission activities in this past fall. One of the things that we learned was that this method is also very applicable for using historical data. The engineering considerations that demonstrate that a historical device is going to be similar or have the same kind of performance as a new device in many ways resemble what you might do if you're doing simulated outcomes in the first place. So that was a really useful finding. We also found that model credibility, and this was really not so much of a surprise, was the main topic. So when you're asking your model to now replace real patients with simulated outcomes, the threshold for demonstrating credibility is extremely high. So obviously a lot of attention paid there. But if you remember how the discount function works, if there's disagreement between your modeled and your real outcomes, then you lose the influence of the model. So that's a protective factor that mitigates the influence of the model and really helps this method go forward. Probably from a social perspective, the most important thing is that there's more stakeholders than you're going to have for a typical application. So if you remember from before, the engineers start having to talk to the statisticians have to understand what the engineering model is doing, and the medical reviewer has to understand really everything. It places a real premium on having models that are easy to understand, statistical methods that are straightforward to communicate. Really a lot more people talking than have had to before, which is great from an innovation perspective, but certainly can be challenging from the perspective of trying to get something new done. So to wrap things up, we've talked here about virtual patients. This is really a new concept that has the potential to transform how we can do some of our medical device and really therapeutic clinical trials in general. For the applications where the model is sufficiently credible, this gives you the chance to enroll fewer patients while really bringing to bear the knowledge that you've gained through the modeling process. The fact that there's a lot more stakeholders than there are in a traditional application puts a premium on early communication. Certainly having a lot more meetings ahead of time is important. And the last thing to talk about, which is really kind of obvious, but is just a great thing about this project, without having the collaborative environment between FDA and industry, we would not have made this progress and we wouldn't be here at all today. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. So if you have questions, please use the IMAG wiki, and the instructions for using the IMAG wiki are right here on these side panels. There's a login and password. Oh, there is a question, yes.
A real life question.
Real life question.
Good morning, Adam. That was a fabulous talk. I don't think you were here yesterday, but we discussed this a little bit yesterday, and this is, I think, the solution right here. To ensuring the validity of our models and using the scientific method as we go forward into more of a virtual environment of understanding engineering and scientific methods and their applications. Can you please talk about how you came up with this? How much of it is rooted in fundamental engineering like safety factors? And how much of it is reiterating the type of approach that industry, like the auto industry or other transport industries, might use?
Yeah, that's a great question. The method was really born out of a need for being able to simulate the outcomes directly. From the industry perspective, the clinical studies that we're having to run are getting larger and larger because we need to have a lot more certainty about what the outcomes are going to be. And so when we started applying design for reliability, having our engineering models actually showing us what the outcomes were going to be, we realized we're basically having to simulate the clinical study before we even run the clinical study. And that really kind of got us to a point where we could see not just the engineering results, but seeing the clinical study results. And then it was I don't want to say straightforward, but when we started talking with the clinical statisticians, they said, we can make use of this. And that's where they were able to look back to what they've already seen with Bayesian methods. Good question.
So what you presented is, since you mentioned statistics, is in a more formal way, is basically a multi-fidelity model where the high fidelity is your clinical data and the low fidelity could be the virtual data or any other models or actually expert opinions. So what you actually have is an autoregressive scheme where you use this hierarchy, and then you can also include the element of active learning because since you're predicting uncertainty, uncertainty can actually tell you, and you have this hierarchical modeling of the autoregressive scheme, can tell you which next, if you want to do one more clinical, if you want to register one more patient, what would that be? Or how many virtual patients would take instead of a real, and so you can, your analysis can actually find that. And they're now, so this is kind of a linear concept of multi-fidelity, which is sort of popular now in physical science, but also there's a nonlinear version we published recently where even if the virtual data, the virtual patient pulls you the wrong direction, the low fidelity, so you have like gold data and silver data. The silver data pulls you the wrong direction. If you learn the manifold, the correlation between the high fidelity and the low fidelity, you can always safeguard the result, and so you will not pull away from a good answer. So it's a more formal way, and in fact tomorrow we have, in Team 5, we have a session on methods, and some of the presentations will be exactly on that topic.
Thank you.
So I'd like to move along just so we can keep on track. But please put your questions on the wiki, and we'll get to them during the discussion panel. So our next speaker this morning is Dr. Leonardo Angelone. He's a research biomedical engineer in the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories, the Center of Devices and Radiological Health at the FDA. Dr. Angelone leads a research program that focuses on the assessment of energy disposition and heating induced in the human body by medical devices using electromagnetic energy. This involves a combination of both computational modeling and experimental measures applied to several areas of clinical significance, including radiofrequency safety in human subjects during interventional MRI, and the analysis of safety and effectiveness of deep brain stimulators. Dr. Angelone received his degree in electronic engineering from the University of Rome and a PhD in biomedical engineering from Tufts University. He also did a research fellowship in the Department of Radiology at Mass General Hospital at Harvard Medical School. The title of his talk this morning is Use of Computational Modeling for Assessment of Electromagnetic Fields in Medical Devices.
Good morning. I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity of presenting some of the ongoing work that we do in the Office of Science and Engineering Laboratories at FDA. There is indeed some research, we attempt of research or research ongoing at the FDA. In our office, we do science, we do experiments. We also consult with the Office of Device Evaluation when submissions come for FDA clearance and approval, such as the one that Adam has presented before. Our group is a mix of full-time employees. There are some research fellows, postdocs, and PhD students that come spend some time in our department. Typically, the work that we do is funded through internal funding, FDA, but we also do several collaborations, active collaborations with outside entities. As Adam pointed out, it's really important, not only on the industry side, but it's really important for us to maintain a very active collaborative environment, working with academic groups funded through NIH, with industry, and with hospitals. And here you see some of the lists of our collaborators. A brief definition of what within FDA we define as regulatory science, which is really the science of developing new tools, standards, and approaches to assess the safety, efficacy, and quality of and performance of all FDA-regulated products. This is only, of course, the FDA definition. You may look around. There is an NIH or other definition of regulatory science. But really, the point is to ultimately allow patients, which is the interest of everybody, allow patients access to the safe and effective medical devices and really improve public health in this direction. The group, the work we do in our division, the Division of Biomedical Physics, is focused on effect of electromagnetism with medical devices. I'm going to present some of the work that we do, briefly summarizing it in terms of analysis of computational modeling of radiofrequency coils. This is coils that are part of MRI systems. And so we evaluate safety of patients with and without medical devices that undergo MRIs. We are been working with external collaborators in developing new computational models of the human anatomy, the visual family, new model, the MIDA model. The models, they are then released and made freely available to the scientific community as possible tools to then evaluate electromagnetic fields. And finally, some of the applications of these models and experimental testing with respect to safety of patients with implanted medical devices. one study we had done was the evaluation of RF coils. RF coils is one of the three components of an MR systems. There is static fields, gradients, and RF. Those are the ones that are used to elicit the MRI signal. The idea is, what are the aspects that really affect what are the parameters and the variables that really affect the performance of the coil, and what are the parameters that affect the electromagnetic fields within the body. We have looked at literature, and you can see, what is available in literature, several different approaches. Sometimes there is not really too much information provided by people publishing their work in terms of how in-depth they have simulated, they have built the computational model of the coil. So by looking into literature, we have reproduced models available in literature, and then we have compared the results of the simulations with experimental measurements. What you see here is a schematic of a robotic system, is a robotic arm that allows the measurements of electric field and magnetic field through probes into the coil that is available in our lab. And we have done these measurements in what we call phantoms. They are no more than boxes filled with saline solutions or gel solutions. And we're compared with the results of our models. Here is some of the results that we have found are available, and we have published these results in last year, the IEEE. Apart for the letters and the acronym, they mean little, but pretty much the physical really refers to the actual measurements. And then the other 5 legends, the S2, G32, these are models. They are computational models. They are being built based on results available in literature. As you can see, some of these models really were far from reproducing the actual measurements. Some others were pretty close. Why does it really matter? Well, if the model, the S2 or the G32, these are 2 models. One implies some deep knowledge about the specific geometry of the coil. This knowledge often is not available to people that are trying to evaluate medical devices, because this is knowledge which stays with the MR system manufacturers, whereas the medical device manufacturers that may generate a neurosimulator or a cardiovascular system are not necessarily aware of that. So when they have to evaluate the safety of the patient with their device in an MR environment, here is a gap that lack of information. So how much information do they need to take into account? And ultimately, as an FDA, this informs us is what type of questions do we need to ask, and what type of questions are really needed to know rather than nice to know with respect to evaluation of safety of patients. And also, it depends strongly on the context of use. So this is results in a plane inside the box phantom. These are results, they are taken outside the box phantom, where different models, so models that just point your attention to the S2 and the G32, they are quite similar in terms of magnetic field top of the image and electric field bottom left. Whereas if you go to different areas, so outside the phantom, then the results obtained between the S2 and the G32 start to be different. Why does it matter? Well, inside the phantom may replicate the environment of implanted devices, fully implanted devices, pacemaker, neurosimulators. Outside the phantom is where you may see devices such as EEG leads, EKG leads, or even external fixators, orthopedic devices. So depending on the concept of use, the type of information needed to model the coil and to understand the electric field varies. Another area that we're working in collaboration with other groups, ANSYS, CITES foundations, and MR comps, is an interlab analysis of a coil. So we have taken a physical coil available in our labs. We have distributed some information, limited information, to 4 different groups with different experience in terms of evaluation of electromagnetic fields, different experience in terms of MR safety, which they have used each different software platforms and approaches which were really left to them. And then we have regrouped the results and compared in terms of electric field and magnetic field found inside a phantom or outside a phantom compared to the measurements. This is work that is ongoing. Again, it speaks to we have found quite interesting results, which really goes to the expertise that you have in terms of software may not be sufficient because you may need to have expertise specific to MR. Platforms may or may not matter, again, depends really on the context of use. This is, I'm showing on the top right some of the results. The dots are represent the comparison point by point between simulations and measurements. Each quadrant is a different team, and we have done different way of driving the coil. CW and CCW represent simply a clockwise or a counterclockwise polarization for those that are familiar with that. Bottom line, really, what we are seeing, we have a plane where all the teams, even given the limited information that we have provided, were pretty much able to reproduce the measurements within the cone of uncertainty, which is the gray area in the image, the gray cone in the image. Of course, again, there are other aspects of the coil. If we look at coil performance, then it's a different, completely different story. That is maybe something that coil manufacturers are interested in. Again, it's context of use once more. Some of the maps, just to give an idea of the comparison, the results, the measurements is on the left. Here is the measurements, the coronal and the actual plane. This is measurement of electric field and magnetic field within the phantom, and this is the numerical results obtained by the team. I just point out that some of the things have obtained completely different symmetry compared, like team 4, compared to the other 3 teams. This was quite interesting because they say, well, the information provided was the same. The expertise may change. The software doesn't really matter. Team 3 and Team 4 were using the same software platforms, but the experience of the users was different and the approach was different. And also, again, it depends of which area are you interested of your environment. Are you interested in the electric field inside the phantom? Or are you interested in the electric field at near the wall of the phantom? That will depend also where the specific device is implanted within the body. This is ongoing work we have submitted, and this work has been submitted to peer review and is ongoing revision. Another question and aspect that we have evaluated over the past years was the effect of coil parameters. Often, as I mentioned, the information, the specific information on the geometry of the coil is unknown. What is easy to learn, to know, is the diameter and the length of the coil. Then, as you point here, this is an image of a coil developed in our lab. The position of the cables that feed the coil is as it is in clinical system, is unknown to the user, is unknown to the medical device manufacturer, and needs to evaluate the safety of the patient often. And so we asked ourselves how much, for example, the way that the position of these feeds affect the RF-induced heating. We have used computational models. This is the virtual population that was developed by the FDA in collaboration with EDIS Foundation in Switzerland, and it's available for research. And we have evaluated we have varied the parameters in the coil. This is pointing to the way the coils were fed in our computational model. And then evaluated the results in terms of energy absorption. SAR is an acronym that really stands for amount of energy over density. Some of the results pointed out that, again, depending on which is the quantity of interest that is evaluating, the parameters have or do not have significant effect. If you look at the overall energy distribution in the human body, where there is the model of an old elderly person, Glenn, or the model of a 34 years old male, Duke, the effect of the position of the sources and the way the sources are fed does not really change the amount of overall energy. The radar plots, each of these lines represents a level of energy, and they are pretty much comparable across the two systems. On the contrary, if you look at local deposition, so if you look at the localized energy deposition within the body, then you can have changes of up to threefold depending on the model, depending on the position of the sources. And that speaks to uncertainty in terms of evaluation and also information that needs to be taken into account when evaluating safety of patients in MR. Another area that we have been working over the past years is development of new computational models of the human anatomy. As I mentioned, one was developed by Dr. Kynes in collaboration with his foundation, is the virtual family first. There were 4 models, then extended to virtual population, which is being released, made available, and is being used in several regulatory submissions to the FDA. The number here is 120. Most likely it's much more than that, in fact. I personally reviewed as a consultant several submissions where models, computational models of the human anatomy, the virtual family, as well as the visible human med from the National Library of Medicine have been used to evaluate RF-induced heating in MRIs. So this is certainly a tool that is being widely applied to the evaluation of safety of patients with respect to electromagnetic fields. A second model that we have worked over the past 2 years and work led by Dr. Iacono was an advanced model of the human head. What was missing, the gap was in the virtual family, was the specific resolution of areas in the brain and in the head. So we have worked again back with this foundation, University of Vienna and Mass General Hospital, acquired new data and generated a model that is 0.5 millimeter resolution over 200 structures, anatomical structures just within the head, with specific attention of some structures such as the blood vessels, so the deep brain structure of the brain. The model is freely available. I encourage everybody to download the model. There is only a $5 fee to pay for verification of identity, just to be precise. But really, and we are pleased to see that over 130 groups worldwide have already downloaded the model. They have been using it, and we have seen also paper already using the model since it was released 2 years ago. Some of the details of the models, so we have acquired T1 and T2 weighted images. We have acquired MRA and data as well as the diffusion imaging that allow to segment different structures. Here are some images of the deep brain structures as well as the bones and vessels. The model is made available in several formats, mostly voxel-based. We are working in trying to have, there is a FEM, finite element method, version of the model. We're still working in improving that. And in fact, any interest in that direction would be welcome. It's always welcome any type of collaboration. Resources are always limited. One of the applications that the model was used was the analysis of electric fields for alternate current stimulation. Another area that we looked at is the application of the models for analysis of safety of patients with DBS. This work that was started when I was a Mass General, and then was being continued, funded actually by NIH through a U01 program. Our academic collaborator was interested in developing new technology based on resistive tapered strip line. On the other hand, a specific way to evaluate this new technology in MR was missing. So on the FDA side, we were interested in investigating the methods and the tools to evaluate the technology rather than later on the collaborator would go on to generate prototypes. We have used computational models to evaluate the safety. So the model would include the specific model of the DBS lead, as well as clinical paths taken from CT scan, and then built the prototype of the new type of lead, which and tested in MR. Just to summarize, hope I was able to provide some of the example of the ongoing work that we are doing within our lab and our group. And we have worked also with the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. We have generated a working group that specifically focuses on RF heating. Really, it's always the emphasis of collaborating with academia and industry rather than a work based on a serial approach where academia have the initial idea, does the basic research, and it passes to industry, and then a few years later comes to FDA, and then as the FDA say, well, no, this is not the correct approach, you have to go back and redo everything. We always really encourage to collaborate, to start since the beginning, based on the protocol, developing new approaches. And would like to thank you for your attention. Here is my email. In case you have any contact, just 2 seconds to encourage your participation. If you want to hear more about the work that we are doing as an FDA modeling and the collaboration with the industry, there is the conference of FDA, BMES, Frontiers in Medical Devices that we are organizing with Adam Hines and Melissa Nod and Tina Morrison at the College Park, May 16 to May 18. And you're free to contact me with any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonardo. We have time for one question. Yes.
So that was fascinating. Thanks very much. The question I have relates to multiscale modeling. And so with all of these verification and validation procedures you put forth, especially for RF heating, there's some continuum measures you're using and continuum models for interpreting them. How do you know that you don't have to go down to a lower length scale? How do you know that heating, that pathologic heating would occur, say, on a barb and a lead? How do you know how far down you have to go?
Well, that's a very good question, a very open question, which is case specific. And so far, the community as a whole is looking at tissue damage, which is, in terms of RF heating, we are interested in different aspects. The parameter, for example, that the pacemaker community have used was not evaluation of temperature, was evaluation of pacing capture threshold. And there was agreement based on literature that was a good parameter to evaluate damage. For the neuro community, the open question is, how much is the volume and what is ultimately the effect in terms of neuronal response? I haven't shown, but there is ongoing work in trying to go more in depth and trying to link the effect of electric fields to the neuronal response. And the question we're asking is, do we see any change? And even with the model, the head model that we have shown, well, we went to 0.5 millimeter. Was it really necessary? And so then once we go down there, we can even go back and say, do we see the same results in terms of electric field or when we use a resolution of 3 millimeter or 1 millimeter? And that's somewhat informed. But it's a very much open question we are still investigating specifically.
Thank you, Leonardo. So just as a reminder, if you have questions for our speakers, please use the IMAG wiki. The instructions are right here on these side panels. Now I'd like to introduce the final speaker for this morning's session. Our speaker is Dr. Eugene Civilico. Gene is the program manager for the SPARK program, which is a program within the NIMH Common Fund. The SPARK program stands for Stimulating Peripheral Activity to Relieve Conditions. This program seeks to use the latest anatomical, physiological, and computational methods, including predictive simulations, to drive mechanistic target development for neuromodulation of organ function via peripheral nerves. Before joining NIH and SPARK, Dr. Civilico had been at FDA's Center for Devices and Radiological Health, where he helped develop a research portfolio targeted at common problems in the translation of neuroengineering research concepts into clinical solutions. Gene received his PhD in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania Medical School and did a postdoctoral fellowship at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute. The title of his talk this morning is MSN in SPARK, Plans and Stretch Goals. Gene?
Okay. Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and to all of you for being here. Let me just find my remote here. So, good morning. As Andrew said, my name is Eugene Civilico. I run a program called Spark. If you read the deep cut on my bio in the program, in a sentence there, I threw in the fact that the first thing I ever did in science was a biophysically realistic compartmental simulation of a bunch of olfactory bulb neurons. That was in 1998 as an undergraduate using something called the General Neural Simulation System, or Genesis. Any Genesis fans out there? Anyone ever use Genesis? I see one. So back then there was Genesis and Neuron. I think Neuron kind of won. But Genesis was very similar, using capacitors and resistors to model the axial and membrane resistances of neurons. So in tribute to that, I have the Bauer-Purkinje cell up here on my opening slide. So this session is about multiscale modeling, and for that reason, I put a lot of different scales up here of the work that we're thinking about in the Spark program. We deal with neural circuitry. As you can see here in the center, the neural circuitry of the peripheral nervous system and the organs that it innervates. We deal with new technology development. You can see here a many hundreds of contacts array that has been developed at UCLA for monitoring the electrical activity across the heart. We deal eventually with cellular processes, internal cellular processes, such as you can see here in the virtual cell, and we deal with devices like this optogenetic implant that you can see here that's been developed in the Rogers Lab under Spark funding. And we, just in the last couple of days, have released a new funding announcement asking for help with a major simulation effort. So I'm very glad to be talking to you this morning, because it may be that some of you are the people that are going to help us do that, help us build what we're trying to build. So before I get to that, I want to zoom out just a little bit and talk about what is the Spark program. So Andrew told you it's stimulating peripheral activity to relieve conditions. Spark is targeted at a specific instance of a recurring problem. If you care about how things work, but you also care about helping people, which is how I sort of think of myself, you have this recurring problem that therapies are discovered and deployed and tested in a somewhat empirical fashion, a somewhat phenomenological fashion, but they need to be improved and searched for somewhat rationally. So that's the sort of big picture, right? You have a conflict between sort of serendipity of discovering that something works versus the need to understand how it's working so that you can make it better. That's the big picture. So Spark is targeted at a currently developing instance of that problem, which is this idea of neuromodulation in the peripheral nervous system, which is having some success. So you have several recent FDA approvals of devices that work this way. The Inspire system stimulates the hypoglossal nerve. It's intended to work against sleep apnea, and there is evidence that it does. The Interagency Maestro is a device that stimulates the vagal nerve, is intended to work against obesity. Moving out of the peripheral nervous system, NeuroPace was a recently approved closed-loop device that detects brain activity and does some algorithmic work on it and delivers electrical stimulation to theoretically stop a seizure before it starts. St. Jude Brio is a deep brain stimulation, goes on and on. This is the last few years, a lot of really exciting things happening that have been able to make the case to the FDA that the potential benefit outweighs the potential risk. And here's some more. Keeps on going. So, but despite that success, there are also a lot of misses. And here are some of the misses. These are things that have been tried and have not met the primary efficacy endpoint in their randomized controlled trial. And typically that will cause them to not be approved by the Center for Devices at the FDA. And these devices have failed in some scientifically interesting ways. In all of the cases here on the slide, the randomized controlled studies followed successful open label studies. So studies where either the patient or the provider knew who was getting the treatment and who wasn't, and it appeared that the thing had worked. But when it was repeated in a randomized controlled fashion, they saw a large sham arm effect, which means that in patients who, for example, were implanted with an inactive device, they benefited as well before the device was even turned on. Even controlling for that, in these studies, there was often a remarkable response in some of the patients. And the response is remarkable enough that it makes you think there is probably something there, but it wasn't in enough of the people, or the data was too muddy, or the controls were not done, that you can't make the case in the strongest possible way. So what are some reasons why this might be? How could we identify the people who benefited from these interventions in advance versus the people who didn't, and possibly design the trials better to be able to demonstrate that benefit for those people? So as a scientist, as a neural circuits guy, it's not surprising to me that there's been a mixed record here because of all the things that we don't know. We don't know which cells you're trying to hit. We don't know what those cells see from your stimulator because we don't know how the field is distributing in the tissue, calling back to some of Leonardo's work at CDRH. We don't know how much activation we're trying to get. Typically, the way these things are dosed is you turn them up until the patient is annoyed, and then you turn them down a little bit, and that's the dose. And that's not rational. You know, it's empirical, it's phenomenological. We don't know the temporal pattern. So you'll go to medical device conferences and talks will have titles like temporal pattern of brain stimulation, does it matter? You know, as a circuits person, you sort of think, well, of course it matters. You know, that's what the brain does, right? Variance in anatomy from subject to subject or pathology, effective drug interactions, how does the system adapt? So as a room full of modeling people, you all should be able to see kind of where I'm going with this, right? The only way to get a handle around all of these different things is to build simulations that incorporate the investigations of all of these different things that are coming from all different people, and have something integrative that lets you benefit from all of the aggregate knowledge that's being produced across all of these different areas. And that's assuming that all of these things are actually being studied, which in many cases they aren't at all. So what we need to do is build a structure to catch that data as it comes, and we also need to make sure that that data is coming. We also need to worry about our animal studies, our animal models. A lot of the animal work presumes drug small molecule interactions, which are largely similar in any mammal with a circulatory system as to one another. So if you inject a rat with a compound, that compound will interact with its target in the rat in a similar way to if you inject a human with that compound. That's not true if you put an electrode on the rat's vagus nerve and you put an electrode on the human's vagus nerve. They're different sizes, they have different mechanical properties, they have different electrical properties because of their size. So we need to think about these things. So the ultimate goal of the SPARK program is to build predictive functional maps of the human peripheral nervous system in relation to selected organ targets. And what we've done so far is we've planted many seeds in the organ areas where we think there's something really valuable to be done here. And the seeds that we've planted, it was kind of recognized that this is a highly multidisciplinary effort. And NIH has a mechanism called the Common Fund when there's a recognized need for something that requires expertise that crosses NIH institutes and that is not just confined to the mission of one NIH institute. And so this program was put together as a collaboration between NIBIB, which brings the bioengineering expertise and the data science expertise and the simulation expertise, NINDS, which brings the expertise in nerves and neurophysiology and implantable device, translation and research, NCATS, which has a strong interest in working, that's the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, which enables us to work more closely with industry and pilot new mechanisms of doing things so that we can all come together. and NIDDK, which has very deep expertise in many of the organ systems where we are trying to operate. All of this is kind of run by me and my team out of the Office of Strategic Coordination, which is part of the Office of the NIH Director. And our job is to set an overall vision and make sure that all these things work together instead of sort of just working in parallel. So we try to get people to forget that they work for NINDS or NIBIB or NCATS and have them just thinking that they work for Spark. And we're actually having a lot of success with that, and we have a real team, very cohesive team. So what have we done? What are the seeds that we've planted so far? We're in at least 4 organs right now: heart, lung, stomach, intestine. This is the kitchen sink. There's a few other things that are not large efforts right now, but they could become large efforts. Adipose tissue, pancreas, bladder. All of these tissues have really interesting innervation patterns that are highly understudied. So we've planted these seeds. These teams are moving forward and starting to bring some of the new technology, the new imaging and stimulation technologies that in a lot of cases have been developed through the Brain Initiative, and are starting to bring these to bear on the peripheral nervous system, where we really have some very low-hanging clinical fruit. All of that is being built on top of a tool development effort and is intended to be coordinated by a data and resource center. So now I get to the part where I'm actually asking you all to get in touch with us and help us to build the framework that this is all going to live in. This is a truly multi-scale problem. Okay, so this is kind of a toy version of the problem. We've got, imagine that you've got a device, right, and you attach the device to a nerve, and you need to first model the electric field that's coming out of your device and how it interacts with the cross-section of this nerve. We need to know which fibers are running in here and where they go when they get to my sort of cartoon visceral organ here, which is intended to represent all the organs. When they get there, they're going to release different transmitters that are going to interact with each other, which is something else that needs to be modeled, which is a different scale of modeling from the EM field coming out of the electrode. And it's located in an entirely different part of the body, because this could be multiple feet here between the site of action of the electrode and the ultimate chemical effect on the organ. Okay, this is sort of like the internet of the body, the peripheral nervous system. So it has to be multi-scale, and it has to be multi-physics. We also need better measurements of the result. Okay, we don't have moment-to-moment measurements of organ function. We need to model those outputs, and we also need to create the devices that will give us those outputs. So to go from the electrode to the circuit to the organ and the synapses to the readout, this is a truly multi-scale effort that has to feedback and iteratively interact with the anatomy that we're doing, which in some cases has not been done before. So this is a slide right out of the notebook that we use to design this program. So I would have made this graphically a little better, but as you know, there's going to be some budget cuts. So you're going to get the artisanal hand-drawn figures, and you better get used to seeing a lot more of these. So the idea here, this is the sense of the multi-scale that I just tried to lay out for you in the previous slide. Scale 1, electricity, magnetism, finite element modeling. What is coming out of these devices? Scale 2, biophysics, neuronal activation. Here's the lines, the field lines carried over from the previous scale, activating nerve fibers. Action potentials go down, they split. Where do they go? Scale 3, biochemical kinetics. The action potential gets to the end of the cell. It releases stuff. The stuff interacts with other stuff. And that causes the organ to do something. If it's the bladder, you're talking about an actual mechanical endpoint. If it's the heart, you're talking about an electrical wave endpoint that turns into a mechanical endpoint. If it's the pancreas, you're talking about something that gets secreted into the bloodstream. So multi-scale, right? So the idea is that the green box and the blue boxes are single-scale models that will be built as part of our ongoing organ efforts. Some of these things are already happening. Some of them we need you to help us with. Those would be part of Spark 1 and Spark 2, the sort of organ and technologies effort. Spark 4, with a FOA that has just come out, we want you to build the container that can hold all of these things online, and we want you to build the connectors that can have them talk to each other, okay? And this is a really hard problem, but I think will produce something really exciting, which would give us the ability to ask the system, what will happen if I attach an electrode at this particular access point in the body and I deliver a particular stimulus, what will happen both to my organ of interest and to all the other organs that we know that that nerve is also connected to, which is something that is really not thought about too much. So Spark 4, Data and Resource Center cores, just released. This is a compressed timeline. We have a minimal LOI. It's very minimal. It's basically your name and your plan. It's a few hundred words limit, due April 7th by email. I used the U.S. government's official link shortener to create this so that I could read it to you. It's go.usa.gov, little x, big B, little k, big A. That's go.usa.gov, small x, capital B, lowercase k, capital A. Grace knows where to find us. We're having office hours to discuss this next week. Better click on this fast. I don't know how much longer we're going to have a government link shortener, but it works very well. I think the U.S. Digital Service built it. And these are the 3 cores that are described in this FOA. You don't have to apply to all of them. We will put you together into sort of a super team, but the 3 core functions are storing and accessing the data that people are creating, the anatomical and physiological and simulation data that people are creating. The map core is to build an interactive, modular, sort of high-level visualization of the data that's coming out of this program. And the sim core, the container and the connector that I described before, host and connect simulations to create predictive, multi-scale, multi-physics models of the neuromodulation of organ function. So to drill down on this a little bit, we are really trying to make something new here. We're going to fund this with something called Other Transactions. It's not a cooperative agreement. It's not a grant. It's sort of like a supercharged cooperative agreement where we get all up in it. I think it's very potentially exciting, and we're really looking for unusual teams and unusual people to work on this with us. You want to make something that hosts the components, builds the links, builds an interface that does not require someone to understand the underlying models, let you run the composite model in either direction. So you could say, I want to speed up the heart rate. Where do I stimulate? Or you could say, I stimulated here. What should I expect the heart to do? You know, really bringing the idea of modeling into a concrete deliverable for people and including uncertainty quantification that can drive additional non-modeling experiments. So tell us where the variation is coming from, and that's where we'll tell people to slice up the tissue and try to understand. I think that's the real power of what modeling can do is hypothesis generation to kind of tell you where more replicates are needed in the meat space. This is everybody who works on Spark. You can feel free to contact, I'm sure everyone in this room knows Grace. You can feel free to contact Grace and she can tell you which of these people to talk to. That's probably the easiest way. And I just want to do, I want to make you aware, this is me on Twitter, G Civilico NIH. This is the Common Fund on Twitter, NIH_Common Fund. All of the funding announcements come out there. This is our website. And I just want to, because this is the medical devices session, I want to add a little coda here. As Andrew mentioned, before I started running Spark, I worked in the labs at FDA alongside Leonardo and Donna, and I still have a guest affiliation there, and there from time to time. I want to try to make a little push that a lot of modeling that you see, I'm going red here, I got one more minute. A lot of modeling that you see in the medical device space has to do with device properties, things that come out of the device, or things that engineers are used to thinking about. But for active devices like neuromodulation devices, and actually really for any device, you need to also think about the properties of the cells, the cellular properties of the tissue, which are critical to understanding the function. And this is a line that I feel like we really need to get over. So we have to have models that get across this line, that go from an electric field to an action potential to a diffusable second messenger. And some people might say, well, modeling is really about safety because then we have to get into humans and da-da-da. And that's true, but safety is not just the absence of cell death. So if you spend some time at FDA, you'll hear a lot about safety, and safety is incredibly important, but safety is more than just do neurons die. So I would like everybody in here, I think, is very facile with computational methods. A lot of times the implied thing that someone is trying to prove, this stimulation pattern is safe because it doesn't kill neurons. But the brain can run malware on hardware that is perfectly alive, right? So making a statement like this is sort of like saying this .exe is safe because it's not going to physically incinerate my CPU. That is necessary, but that is not enough because that exe may do something that you don't want. You know, and if you put a stimulator in the brain and it causes you to perseverate on suicidal ideation but doesn't kill any of your neurons, that is not a safe device. And you know, for the organism that is carrying it around inside of it. So we really, really have to get beyond just thinking about, is this going to burn me? And get towards how does this interact with the circuitry of my brain and my nerves to do the thing that I'm trying to get it to do. So I'm going to leave it there and put that back up again, and I will stop. Thanks.
Thank you, Gene. Please stay up here because we're going to start our discussion panel. If I get the other two speakers up. So if you have questions, you can either come to the microphone or post them on the wiki. Yes.
I have something of a general question, actually, for all of the panelists, which is that in the world of aircraft safety, there's a distinction between lifetime prediction and failure prediction. And so in the aircraft world, we're interested in understanding a number of cycles before some kind of inspection is done, safety inspection or a status inspection. So in the types of models that the three of you have been talking about, do you factor in for a lead lifetime safety, for a neuromodulation protocol, and so forth? Do you factor in periodic investigations of some sort into determining safety, or is really the state of the art just initial failure analysis now?
Oh, it's green now, thanks. The industry perspective, specifically cardiac rhythm, for example, pacemakers, there's some areas we have good line of sight to when the device is going to stop working, for example, battery life. So there's pretty well-established methods to know when you need a new battery. For things related to when is it going to break, there are not good ways to both measure and also to intervene. So, for example, there's been some defibrillator leads that have where you've been able to see evidence of insulation wear by X-ray, which is kind of a good thing and a bad thing to see, because you can tell the patient, well, your lead is still working, but I can see that it's kind of broken now. So there's not a really great system set up to do preventative maintenance on many medical devices. I don't want to say all. Whereas for an airplane, it's right from the start, you've got inspection built in, and the whole idea of preventative maintenance and being able to do repair and even see a crack and monitor a crack as it proceeds is kind of part of the life. So it's different in the area of medical devices because patients aren't used to being told they've got something that's imperfect in them. It's pretty challenging.
To add to that, couple of examples where the use of the device is evaluated. For example, if you have a stimulator, a lead, and stays in the body, it turns out that the leads are not perfectly sealed. So over time, there is liquid that goes into the lead itself. That liquid changes the electrical properties of the lead. So the evaluation of RF safety needs to take into account the amount of liquid that goes into the lead over time. And this is currently done in the analysis of the safety. The second aspect is multiple exposure during MRI. What if a patient has the first exam, then another exam on the second day and third day? What is the effect of those multiple exposures, if any? It's true that thermal damage may be considered an acute effect, but there are also possible chronic mechanisms. And to the third point that was also mentioned by Jim, the state of the art is we look at temperature, we look at thermal damage over time. What is the brain doing when it's exposed to 42 or 43 degrees Celsius? You may not see any effect in the short term. Are there any effect long term? As an FDA, we cannot really ask nice to know questions where there is no base. It really weighs is the balance between benefits and risk, with the emphasis now more and more on benefits rather than risk. We've heard safety, but it's really, we want to allow to our patients to have access to the images, and those are the benefits of MRI. New questions, if we were to have additional information, then yes, that would need to be taken into account in terms of chronic effect. Thanks.
So I have actually two questions, if I'm allowed, but let's start with the first one. You showed Spark 1, Spark 2, and then jumped to Spark 4, and you started with the bottom-up approach. I'm not talking about the freeze that's missing, but you started with the components and then built up. Why not start the other way around? Was there some other reasoning for this, historical or some other reason?
It's largely historical. It's mostly because these things evolve rather than you can't design them from the beginning and then sort of lay out all the dominoes and then hit the first dominoes and watch them go. Our understanding of what we need has evolved since the program started. It was more important to get people going and get people in, and then use that insight to understand how to be integrative.
Okay. Second question is about populations. Both the first speakers showed some population. I think the first one showed the synthetic population, second one showed the slide with all the people with different sizes. So how accurate do you generate your populations, or how accurate you need the information to be in the case of a synthetic one, or if it's real one, how much data do you actually need?
So first, let's distinguish precision from accuracy, the way I see it. Precision is how many structures do we have, how much resolution in terms of spatial resolution. And you can be more precise, but you can be farther and farther from the truth. Accuracy I define as actually with respect to the real anatomical structure of the body. So in terms of precision, the current state of the art visual family, we're talking about 1 millimeter resolution, about 60 to 100 up to 200 anatomical structures distinguished anatomically. The use of these structures with respect to the specific application, whether it is electromagnetic analysis or thermal analysis, make it such that the number of structures distinguished become less, because a lot of those anatomical structures have the same electrical properties. In terms of anatomical accuracy, all of those segmentations have been then evaluated by anatomists and compared with respect to the original MRI data of the subjects as well with Atlas. And that was the work specific of the anatomist. How much accuracy in terms of electromagnetic analysis? We are actually in the process of generating new models where we are not only comparing the structures, the anatomical structure, we're comparing the results of the simulations with the MRI images, the B1 images, and that's a second level of accuracy. How much do you need? It depends on the application. It depends on what is it they are looking for. Are you looking for heating? around the specific lead? Are you looking for distribution of energy? Or are you looking to your model reproducing the weight of the original? And I was just talking yesterday with one of my colleagues that one of the models out there, the visible human model, the weight of the subject, this is the subject of the National Library, was sliced, and the original weight was 106 kilograms. If you look at the weight of the model, it's 92 kilograms. Well, that's because the subject was dead, it was sliced, and you take out all the blood and everything else. So just to give an idea. Thanks.
Yes, I think we have a question from the wiki.
So we have two questions from the wiki, and they're somewhat related. So I'm going to read both the questions and then ask Adam if he can respond. The first question's from Ted Dick from Case Western. Adam, he's curious about your introductory slide that showed a pie chart representing the relative roles of bench, animal, human, computational, and virtual patients at present and in the future. When you resize the slices, the slice representing humans stayed relatively the same compared to bench and animals. My question is, will virtual humans include pathophysiology, behavior in chronically ill humans, etc.? How close are we to running experiments comparing results from a diseased and normal virtual human? And then we had another question from Ching Long Lin from the University of Iowa, and I think it's somewhat related, so I'm going to go ahead and read that as well. Adam, you said on your slide number 2, quote, "Yet we still run clinical studies the same as 20 years ago." This is not a true statement. For example, the multi-center trial studies such as Severe Asthma Research Program, which started in 2001, and Spiromix, COPD study, sponsored by NIH, NHLBI, have been advancing precision medicine rapidly. These studies have been collecting rich sets of diverse data, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally, including genetic, biological, imaging, and clinical data over large populations. Different machine learning techniques have been applied to identify molecular clusters, clinical clusters, sputum clusters, and imaging clusters, and different simple clustering has been proposed for classification. There are a lot of experience that we can learn from these studies.
Those are actually a couple of pretty insightful questions. At a pretty high level to answer both of them, there's certainly areas where there's been a lot of progress, but let's maybe give a couple specific examples here. So in the presentation I gave, we used cardiac rhythm products as an example. So there if we think about what we can model now that we couldn't before, from the first question, there's a line about, can you model a disease population? The virtual patient that we're talking about isn't necessarily a virtual human where you've got all aspects of physiology represented, but the failure modes or the therapies of interest. So if you think about a diseased heart, that is probably going to be, say, a different size. And so we can certainly measure and construct virtual hearts that would represent, say, a heart failure population and compare that to a normal population. And indeed, that's something that we have in some of our living heart models. Likewise, if you look at how then you implement that into clinical studies, the clinical studies for a lot of medical devices do look very similar now to how they did 20 years ago. Maybe the only difference is that they have to be a lot bigger now. I can think of a couple examples where the number of patients has grown by an order of magnitude and the length of time has also grown. The person asking the question brought up precision medicine areas, and not being very schooled in that area, I think it sounded like it was a pretty well-written question, or there has been a lot of advances made. But I would ask, for the clinical study endpoints, are we able to bring the knowledge that we have to bear in the analysis of those endpoints? And if so, I think that's probably a really good example of where, in that sense, the virtual patient from a precision medicine perspective is making an impact.
Hi. Thanks for your wonderful presentations today. One question, something we've struggled with in the medical device industry is, the credibility requirements for a computational model. And as an engineer, we're working on that at the macro scale. So something, Gene, you brought up was, the work that y'all are doing at the cellular level and below. And so the question is, how does one go about validating a computational model, establishing credibility requirements, et cetera? And to an engineer who's used to thinking at a bigger scale, how does one go about that process, or how might you think out establishing these credibility requirements to ensure that that computational model is working correctly?
You're well aware of the work that FDA is doing together with other groups on the credibility. It really, I hate to say repeated ways, it depends on the application, but so for RF heating, I wanted to comment on the use of models where in RF heating are really validated models, and I will specify what validated means, are substituting the clinical trial, not only complementing, because there we are a case where we expect cases of 1 in 100,000 or 1 in a million, where no clinical trial feasible could be statistically powered, and where well-validated computational models can really answer the question. And in that case, when I talk about validated models, we're talking about models where you have compared with electrical heterogeneous structures, so typically animal studies or well-complex phantom measurements at all different levels, complete with uncertain analysis, millions and millions of simulations and full Monte Carlo analysis. So for those cases, that is quite credibility in terms of the overall framework of models. Other cases in the past where models were limited or nothing, the labeling of the devices, the access was limited. I'm thinking to the case of the Medtronic DBS system. It's the same system, it's been the same over the past 10 years. 10 years ago, the labeling of MR was extremely limited. Testing was done with phantom gel measurements. Now, with the modeling, that allowed to really extend the use, allows patients with DBS to have MRI on torso, on cancer. So if you are a cancer patient that you have has a mass in the spine, the ability of doing MRI as opposed to CT really can have a huge effect on your health. And so allowing those patients to have that access based on improved modeling, validated models.
I think it's really important to let the predictivity drive the scale. So if the model at the scale you've got is allowing you to predict heating or the phenomena that you're interested in, then you can stop. You don't have to go to cells, just like we all sort of assume you don't have to go down to modeling where the electrons are when you try to figure out heating. You push down to the scale that you need until you have the predictive power that is required for the benefit-risk calculation that you're trying to do. I think it's really important to bring these things out of silos so that all the data in the world that could be brought to bear on that assessment can be connected to the model. It sort of has to become less about what can be built in any one individual silo at a company or in someone's academic lab, and more about, in the same way that you connect a server to the internet, you make sure that it's compliant and you put it out there. And what happens to it after that, it's out of your, you can't control it and you wouldn't want to because you can't see where that's going to be used.
I'm afraid we're running out of time here and we're bleeding into our coffee poster break. So I'd like you all to please join me in thanking our speakers one more time.
We'll break for refreshments until 10:10, and we'll continue with our consortium discussion after that, I think. Hey, Andrew McCulloch, Jay Humphrey, and Danny Bluestein, if you can come on up. Okay, so yesterday during the breakout session, the Multiscale Modeling Steering Committee, which is a new committee formed of PIs from the U01 awardees, met, and our committee this committee has now met 3 times, and they had a great discussion. So I'm going to ask the committee members to introduce themselves on the stage, and Bruce Lee will lead the discussion for the MSM consortium discussion. If you guys have your laptops open, we're on the wiki page for the MSM consortium discussion. So I'll introduce Bruce Lee to come up and take the podium. Thanks.
So I'm Bruce Lee. I'm at the Global Obesity Prevention Center at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Maybe we can have each of the steering committee members introduce themselves.
Salit Joffrey.
I'm Jason Hawk from NC State.
Mike Henson, University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Terry Sanger, University of Southern California.
Hi, I'm Sylvia Blemker from the University of Virginia.
Ellen Cole from Stanford University.
I'm Jeff Holmes from University of Virginia.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So the way we're going to structure this next discussion is first, for the first 10 minutes, we're going to present a summary of our some of our findings in interacting with the working groups and our discussion yesterday at the MSM Steering Committee meeting. So we'll go through some of the major points and present some of our thoughts about that. And then the next part of the discussion will be any working group that wants to come up and summarize some of their findings in terms of deliverables or what they've produced, or react to some of our summary points. And then, so it's optional for each of the working groups, so I don't want to pressure everyone to come up, but if you have things to add or things to report or suggest, that would be great. And then we'll open up the floor to discussion, because one of the things that we'd like to do is get a better understanding of how the working groups are working, how we as an overall consortium can improve things or enhance things, and how we can better serve the community in general. So with that, we've put some of the summaries up here in terms of what we came up with during the meeting yesterday. I wanted to thank Jason for being our very effective scribe. And so there's 2 slides. So each of the MSM steering committee members visited different working groups. So the first point is work group activity. So we found a wide range of activity amongst the working groups. Some work groups were not very active. Of course, some were on the opposite end of the scale. So that's an issue. Why are certain working groups not as active? How we can potentially turn around the situation. We understand that everyone's very busy, and that this is an additional commitment, but hopefully it's one that is aligned with everyone's interests. So some of the potential solutions that came up is whether each of these working groups to go through an evaluation process. So steering committee members evaluate the different working groups and have criteria, whether they're loose or more specific criteria, for either dissolving or combining different working groups, or in some cases maybe splitting different working groups. So that was the first thought. The second issue was work group leadership. So we also found that to be highly variable. In some cases, there were fairly active leaders, and in other cases, some of the work group leaders did indicate that they were interested in having other folks take up the mantle. We also found that the working groups, even though there's significant overlap or synergies in potential interests between the different working groups, they weren't really as coordinated with each other. So there are many opportunities for synergies between the working groups, but those weren't really being utilized to their fullest. So some of the potential solutions included should the steering committee in general take a more active role in making requests to the working groups. So the advantage of the steering committee is that we can see overall, how the working groups are working and what they're producing and what are potential gaps. So would it be helpful for the steering committee to come up with certain requested deliverables or certain strategies that each of the working groups could follow and to help coordinate the different working groups? The third point is working group papers and deliverables. So one of the interests is setting specific deliverables for each of the working groups, so that at the end of the year we know that, okay, the working group might have fulfill these deliverables. So there might be a lack of clear outputs with some of the working groups. Of course, there are working groups that have produced papers and supplements and things like that. So some of the potential solutions are, maybe each of the working groups should have specific tailored goals. So it's not as if every working group should have as a goal a position paper or something of that sort. For some of the working groups, that might be more appropriate. For others, there might be more appropriate deliverables. So in some cases, position papers in higher profile journals. One of the suggestions was linked publications. So each of the titles in a series of papers that come out have multiscale modeling in them or some other way of linking multiple publications so that the outside world understands that this is part of a greater effort. So for instance, if 20 papers out of a working group or the authors that are in a working group come out with 20 papers, if they're somehow linked together so that everyone knows that this is part of a greater effort. We talked about supplements or special issues, and just overall in terms of how do we present MSM publications as a more unified front. So those are the first three issues. Now moving on to the next slide. The fourth issue was webinars. The issue with webinars is there's unclear attendance and interest. So some of the working groups did contribute significantly to webinar speakers, et cetera, but it was unclear like how much outside interest was generated by that. One of the issues that came up, or a potential solution, is establish more regular meeting times. So there's a particular time of a particular day each month or each quarter that the webinar will be, and it's heavily publicized and people really understand and expect that to happen. Secondly, another suggestion that came up was whether these webinars should be more tutorials rather than scientific talks or research talks. So tutorials can generate a fair amount of interest, especially among trainees. And they can also be, they can have longer lifetimes. So if you, say, give a tutorial on a particular type of modeling, like agent-based modeling or system dynamics modeling, that can generate perpetual interest, perpetual hits, or however you're measuring the interest. So that was a potential solution. The fourth issue was interfacing with other outside organizations. So several of the working group brought up the issue of not being able to connect with other relevant organizations. So there might be relevant scientific organizations, professional organizations, or different types of stakeholders. So the potential solution with that is really identifying organizations to connect with, whether the steering committee can help with that, or if there is other mechanisms that the working groups can use to identify organizations and then ultimately broker those connections. And then the sixth issue was communications outreach. So specifically, how do we expand awareness and understanding of multiscale modeling? So this includes amongst different decision makers, amongst other potential funding organizations, and the general public, general media, et cetera. So the potential solutions include constructing a more outwardly facing website. We all know that the wiki is more inward, it's more for the network to communicate with each other, so it's not really designed to be to interface with the outside public. Secondly, using social media, press releases, feature stories, and other means of getting the word out there about specific research, but also investigators in general and general directions. So those are some of the potential solutions that were offered. So with that, I wanted to see if there were any initial reactions from anyone about that, and then we can invite any of the working group leaders who wanted to add some suggestions or report on their progress. Again, this is optional, so you don't have to come up if you don't want to. So, any initial reactions?
I just wanted to ask, at what point, perhaps in the far future, perhaps not so far, will it make sense for this group to be spun off out of the federal government and become an independent meeting? And that might give a lot more initiative and give a lot of different options that might not currently be available, though, of course, we'd lose a lot, like free lunch. So I'm not sure that it's really time yet, but that might be one way to have a broader outreach and broader opportunities for everyone.
Yeah, that was a good point. That actually came up during the steering committee meeting yesterday. The question is whether we're really at that point to be able to spin off as a society and separately. So I think the consensus, and everyone feel free to chime in, was that maybe we're not at that point, and the question would be, what would be the criteria and what would be the benefits and disadvantages of doing that? Does anyone have anything to offer about that?
Yeah, so Bill, we discussed that yesterday, and I think the one message we were not really clear about was whether this would be meetings of the individual groups or an overall meeting of the entire group of the people in the room right now. And we were kind of doing a head count, how many people would eventually be involved in this. I think most of us were supportive of it in general. We just didn't really see the timeline of this evolving. Probably it takes another couple of years for this community to grow, to have really a
There is
number.
a bit of a nidus of this in SimTK at Stanford, and Mark's efforts through his meeting of computational surgery. So there are some, and certainly in computational neuroscience, I think there's a lot of interest in this more biological approach than some of our meetings are currently. But yeah, I don't really think it's time. I'm bringing it up mostly to put it forth for the future.
That's a good point. It's probably something that we can leave on the agenda and look, do check-ins every now and then to see if we're moving towards that direction.
You did What was the great year you did the meeting in Montreal? You did what year?
I think it was 2008.
Right, so it's been done already.
So it was in conjunction with SIAM, right, Jim? So we've been offering up possible different sites, and we're going to talk about meeting sites later again, but often it's been repeated over the last few years that we'd like to keep the meeting here, but if you guys want to change the site, that's up for discussion.
So, can we move on to the general question over here?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I like the idea of the webinar change going to tutorials because there are a lot of things that would help our students and us. And I like the longevity factor. We can also invite experts who may not be now part of the multiscale modeling group to provide their expertise. So I think we can really enrich that process. And otherwise, it does seem to be pretty narrow. And so I think that's a great idea, and I'd be interested to hear if anyone disagrees.
Yeah, I would like to comment that we discussed it and floated the idea, and it happened in a couple of working groups in the past, but there was also coordinated webinars of different working groups that have mutual interests, and this drew larger audiences and was pretty successful. And naturally, there's quite a bit of overlap between different working groups. And in that, of course, if you also the idea that you just raised, that inviting somebody that is not necessarily a multiscaler, but could present some issue or problem that is of interest to a couple of working groups, I think this would be a very efficient tool to increase participation and more activity in the webinars. So that's definitely an opportunity that I think that the working groups should be looking into, collaborating with other working groups.
Thank you, Danny. Anyone else have any other comments? I think it was pretty unanimous that everyone agreed that that would be a good idea. So.
I just want to throw out there an idea, and just sort of curious what people think about it. I'm sort of aware that our structure is very much based on topic areas. So the working groups are sort of application areas of the multiscale modeling. But what unites us as a group is a set of techniques and methods. And that I feel like what I learn most from people in other areas are about their methods. But we don't really focus very much on how the same method could be applied across groups. It's not that we don't do it at all, but I'm just wondering if there'd be some way to incorporate that. I just sort of imagine a talk that sort of looks at the same method applied in, I don't know, clinical medicine and population biology or something, and you see how exactly the same mathematics could be done. That's sort of along the lines of the tutorials, and really being very explicit about the distinction between the methods and the applications. It just might be a helpful way to generate interest even outside this group.
Combining this idea with the previous comment about trying to have a more regular schedule for the webinars would lead naturally to the webinars not just being a collection of tutorials, but a course. So with a bit more advanced planning, I think this could really be an outcome of the consortium that would have sort of significant long-term value.
Yeah, so excuse me, I think part of the thinking was that internally we need to be focused on methods, but externally we need to be focused on the applications we're working on. Because when we communicate to the broader public, what we're doing, it doesn't help to say we're solving stochastic differential equations. So I think internally I agree with your comment that we, a little more focus around the methods that we're using and how they span different applications would be great. Because when I see the webinars and it's focused on an area I don't work in, I don't tend to know what I'm going to get out of it. So I see something on bone remodeling and I'm just like, I don't do that. But if it was on the methods, I'd be more likely, and certainly if it's tutorial, I'd be more likely to see it. So. But again, I think in terms of externally communicating what we're doing, it's very important to be focusing on the problems we're working on and how we're trying to solve them.
Questions over there? Can't hear you. It might be. Okay.
Okay, so, that one works, maybe too much. Okay, so in the theoretical and computational working group, I thought we had a really great discussion, and I want to thank you guys. Even though when the list came to me, I was just like, are you kidding me? There's so many items on that list. But anyways, we thought about this idea of communicating with the public. Really resonated with us, and we're facing a public that not only doesn't understand modeling, but sometimes is just actively against modeling and science in general. And we wonder if maybe a position paper, and maybe this could come, from all of us, on modeling and simulation, written for the public. So, what is a model? It represents our best understanding of a process that may be too complex to just reason about in our heads, and verification, and what goes into a model. Data goes into a model. We don't just dream it up. It doesn't come out of nowhere. Uncertainty quantification, all the things that we worry about, but in plain language. So they understand just how much work goes into it. And I don't know how we could get this into, for example, a newspaper article or something like that, where the public could really see and appreciate. Another suggestion came up for modeling and simulation for biologists and medical researchers, for the part of the community that may not be converted yet, but might have a real use for it. And also maybe some vision papers. Where is modeling and simulation and data? Where is it likely going to be driving biology and medicine in the next 10 years? Another thought we had was advising.
advising the general community, the scientific community, on the following. Is the right data, so many of us have struggled with clinical data that was collected, that might be on the web, right, which is great. That's a great first step, but it wasn't often collected with the idea of modeling in mind. And sometimes with some very small but thoughtful changes, the community might be able to produce data that is not just useful for the problem that it was first envisioned for, but that has just a little bit more detail, and things that nowadays we can have, like, for example, it would be really nice to be able to collect all the medical data, right, automatically out of the machines that are producing it, and not be limited to, say, in the past, well, we collected it at hour 7 or something like that, right? All these, and also, where is the sensors are making just huge progress, okay? Microfluidics-based sensors, et cetera. This kind of technology is going to be coming online fast. And are we positioned to take up that data and to work with the people who are producing the sensors, and how can we make that happen in order to have that be just a smooth flow?
Thank you. I'm very glad that actually you got up and mentioned some of these things, because it was a good reminder of right here. I think some of probably your ideas came and filtered into the committee about this concept of having these overarching papers. So apologies as I neglected to mention this thing. I think that encompasses some of the things that you mentioned, where you have these overall position papers and also things which interface with the general public. So I think those are all really good examples and suggestions. Does anyone on the committee have anything to add or any reaction to that? I think it sounds like we are in agreement that those would be good ideas, or moving more towards that vein. So thank you for those comments.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I just want to mention some of the items discussed in a meeting of the group called Multiscale Systems Biology. So it seems to be the most diverse one. So we kind of talked about interests of the participants, and it covers the whole range. So this group might be very well kind of suited for exactly what was mentioned by the steering committee. It might be a place to put different groups together and discuss specific questions of interest to more than one group. So we put everything on our wiki and kind of mention some specific topics. Also, I want to mention that members of the group discussed possibility of reaching out to general public through professional societies, like Biophysical Society, or Society for Mathematical Biology, Biomedical Engineering Society. There are so many. American Physical Society. And all these societies have active groups on modeling and actually modeling testing. And that might provide like a shortcut for what we want to do.
Okay.
And then specific journals were mentioned, such as PLOS Computational Biology. And I know that's been discussed by the committee. And also Biophysical Journal has a new section called Computational Tools. And they solicit kind of input from groups like ours on different ways of kind of modeling and testing, that's for sure. And also Bulletin for Mathematical Biology. That journal actually was represented by Editor-in-Chief, who is present at the meeting. And this journal is very open to special issues, actually putting together special issues.
Okay, that's a good suggestion. So maybe it might be helpful for us to assemble a list of potential societies that already have modeling presence, as well as a list of different types of journals. Some of these journals, of course, in general we're aware of, but then there are probably journals which we may be missing. So having that type of list could be helpful. Any other?
Yeah, this might be a good place to mention that another thing that came up in our discussions was that
that as part of that outward-looking part, that a lot of what goes on and a lot of what all the groups are doing isn't immediately recognizable as associated with multi-scale modeling, with this consortium, with the working groups, right? And so in terms of thinking about promoting what we do to the outside world, it's very difficult to even search for it if you're trying to, right? And so one of the things we talked about was we may want to think about a more organized system of not just the special issues, but for individual papers of tagging them in ways that allows people to figure out that came out of the MSM and it came out of the working group, and whether that's a consistent way of doing that in the acknowledgement section, not just the grant number. UL1 is not enough because there are many U grants that have nothing to do with MSM, and much of the MSM work is not necessarily being funded by UL1. But coming up with ways to tag things so that you can start to easily find this library of all the things that came out of a particular the members of a particular working group.
Jeff, any other comments or additions? Fred?
One of the things that I found so fascinating about this organization is that you have modelers from many other disciplines who have brought pieces to the bio side. All of those people have another connection to their birthplace, if you will, and all of the birthplaces have their journals, and in the area of publication, not the scientific matter. To publish papers in the energy journal that show the relationship. So you can take the bio and the epidemiology and the energy stuff, and I think do some really nice papers that would read well to the energy modelers and astronomers. I mean, when you look at posters here and seeing how many people who are part of an astronomy program, my goodness, in bioscience. So anyway, that's...
So good suggestion. So transdisciplinary exchange in terms of publishing and other types of home disciplines or cross disciplines, et cetera. Good suggestion. Any comments or reactions? Okay. Up front.
So in population modeling working group, we're actually working on such publications several times, and actually we use the working group term as something, well, our first publication is actually the working group as the main author. Is one example. However, I must say it's sometimes hard to recruit people to participate from the other side. You see all those people here, but when you actually reach out for the experts, it's kind of hard to getting them aboard, even if you use the official elements here. Maybe on your side you might get a little incentive for them. I don't know what or how, but it's something that you may be able to do to make it easier for us to recruit them, kind of.
Okay, so incentivization to participate in the deliverables or the projects. Comments from the rest of the committee? So that's one thing we discussed about, balancing, because everyone's busy naturally. So we have some very busy investigators, in the consortium, also at large in the working groups. So essentially trying to find ways of aligning interests. So if the deliverables are of broader interest to the working group members, then they'll probably be more likely to participate. So that's certainly something that we can discuss. That's one of the reasons why we talked about potentially the steering committee thinking of some overall directions that might be helpful for the working groups. But your point's well taken. There?
So I have a high-level question feeling like an outsider of the consortium coming into my first meeting and seeing the working groups described by topics. So basically, you're breaking up people by their interests, their scientific interests, but not necessarily aligned in their purpose. So if there's some overarching purpose for the consortium, I would think the working groups would be named by their purpose. We want to get more publications. How do we do that? We want to look at sharing our techniques. That might be another purpose. And that way you'd bring together people with different interests into a working group and have them tackle something that's directly aligned with a common purpose that supports the overall purpose of the consortium, rather than splitting them up by interest and then finding, well, we don't know what to do, and also finding that each group comes back to you with the same kinds of ideas, but maybe not enough critical mass to fulfill the purpose.
So is what you're suggesting sort of like committees, say a publication committee, a webinar committee, and so on? Is that the gist?
Well, yeah, with a very explicit purpose.
Any other thoughts or reactions to the comment? I think that's a good point that goes in line with some of the suggestions for the steering committee to potentially come up with directions or missions that each of the working groups can pursue. But thank you for that point. Back over there.
So I just wanted to chime in for the cell to macroscale group and just maybe make people aware of a few things we talked about that really reflect the general conversation here. I would like to say that we conducted a pre-meeting survey online and asked some specific questions like, if you had these keywords to say what your area is, what would that be, to kind of get a better sense of what people are interested in, ask questions about, would you want to do a webinar, have you participated before, and it was illuminating in ways that I wasn't expecting. So for example, I didn't realize that many people hadn't watched webinars or weren't aware of them or how to even access them in a YouTube channel. So I just thought that might be a useful thing for future breakout sessions. We also discussed quite extensively the idea of trying to put together a special issue. So obviously these publication ideas are a commonality that all these groups have. Sort of our variant of that was more focused on sort of technical abstracts or sort of like technical briefs to illustrate methods that were more didactic of, how the method works. Here's some examples, maybe it links to some code. Trying to piece that together and then bookend it with maybe an opinion piece at the beginning that was coming from our sort of collective, thoughts about the utility of this, and then ended by non-modelers that are end users, sort of suggesting from a biological or clinical standpoint that, look, everybody else that's outside the consortium, here's how you might, think about some of these models and how they might be useful to you, so something along those lines. And so I think it would be good to, outside of our working group, also be aware of what all the other working groups are doing to kind of efficiently figure out the best road forward. So I think the steering committee could really help guide that. And then just the third thing I wanted to mention, we had also talked about, public understanding, fostering that. And one of the ideas that was brought out is it would be really neat if we did, not instead of a webinar, but maybe in addition to or something along those lines, more of something along the lines of these 3-minute thesis things, where you just give a very brief, very high level, here's what I do, here's why it's of interest, and maybe even link that to, participants, hyperlink it on a wiki or something of that nature. So we talked about some other stuff, but those are the main points I just wanted to share with everybody.
Those are great ideas, good suggestions. Any reactions from the committee? I think those are good suggestions. Some of those fall under some of the things that we discussed, and I'm sure your comments are some of them filtered into this summary, but those are good specific examples. Back there?
I wanted to make a few comments. This is my first meeting. I'm actually going to be speaking this afternoon from a clinician perspective, and I had the opportunity to jump between the biomechanics group and then to jump into the translational group at the tail end. I think there are a couple of points. I agree fully with our colleague who got up to the microphone, everyone who's spoken so far, but particularly the colleague on the computational side who said we need to get the word out to the public and to really kind of make things more intelligent and intelligible to people from that perspective, because this is a very specific, detailed mathematical kind of domain which a lot of people can't really understand. So I think that's important. Second concept related to that is that I also teach in the business school. There are wants and there are needs. So from a want perspective, you're trying to convince people that they want this, and that's a good thing to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But I come at it from the other side as a clinician. You have to come from the perspective of needs. Why do we need this? And what are the problems that we really have to solve? Because you're developing fantastic tools that basically can be brought into that domain. So I think that incorporating the clinician perspective, even in all the groups, or having it as kind of a central element where we can really tell you where the problems are, what the things that we have to solve in the real world are, then we would be able to bring these tools in to really help that. Related to that, I changed some of the slides that I'm actually going to show this afternoon based on this has been a fantastic meeting, by the way, for me. And really to the point that if you ask the average physician about modeling, they don't even know what you're talking about. Yet they have all the tools and the technical details to provide you information to drive those models. They know the science. They wouldn't get into medical school and come out and be good residents without all that. But so you really have to be able to work and integrate, which brings up another point about could we now developmentally get that into the curriculum? I have enough gray hair here that I'm on a lot of these types of committees, and in terms of medical education, I think that would be very good to start to develop even the language, the lexicon of what this is all about, so you could move this forward in a modern way. Yes, all these sensors are coming online and all that kind of jazz, but the practice of medicine is changing dramatically. So you need to incorporate this just like anatomy and physiology. This is the mathematical computational physiology of the next generation of the practice of medicine, where you'll be doing it from a control tower and monitoring thousands of patients at home by virtue of sensors and then understanding how things are really going to work. So I think that those types of things are critical. And then maybe the final comment, not to hog the microphone, is really about, I also have enough gray hair that I'm president of a couple of medical societies, one having to do with mechanical support, the other having to do with artificial organs. And we would love to have these types of sessions there. So having a group here that wants to put together a mini workshop at these types of things, we'd get the support, we'd have the funding, don't worry about that. It's the matter of who wants to come and talk and interchange, and I think those would be very valuable things.
Thank you. Excellent suggestions. Any reactions? Danny?
Yeah, I would like to follow on what Marvin said here. We have the translational working group, and in that I would think this should be kind of fun of all the working groups, because I've attended the biomechanics working group, and there was some frustration on the fact that, okay, we may have success stories, but where do we go with it? And for that, in each of the working groups, I'm sure that there was some translational values that could be highlighted, and probably for the position papers also this is very important, that people will realize what's the real utility of multiscale modeling, and also towards moving towards precision medicine, which is the major direction in medicine in general, and multiscale modeling I think is kind of eminent part of it.
I think one of the things that's been raised is talking about getting the information out to sort of the wider public in some sense about what models are and their importance. But I think another thing that we might be able to contribute is understanding the proper designs of models and the limitations of models. You point out this, what I might, this utopian vision of the doctor sitting in a control tower controlling thousands of patients, which I might consider a dystopian vision. One of the concerns that's raised about that is when you put sensors on people, you obtain only the information you asked for. And as clinicians, we're very aware that often it's the information you didn't ask for that helps you treat the patient. So that I would take that as an example of a situation in which models can be tremendously helpful for solving certain problems, and in which understanding their limitations would also be important, and that those are both things that a group like this might be in a very good position to address.
In regards to publicity, in the steering committee meeting, Grace mentioned a couple of times that she and her people want to get out the word. They want to have success stories written in language that an eighth grader can understand, basically the general public. So you could publicize what's going on here, what we're doing, and why it's useful. And if you have good success stories, I mean, you need to bring them to attention of Grace so she can, and get her the information she needs to get these things publicized.
Yeah, I think the idea of us going to the outside community in terms of other meetings would be very valuable, because I didn't even know about this consortium until I had something funded, and then I got an email saying you need to attend this meeting, and I'm like, okay, I'll better go. So I think this is very insulated community. Not many people know about it, unless you have some reason to know about it. So I think the idea of us going to different meetings with workshops and special sessions to communicate what we're doing would be extremely valuable.
As part of the Midas network, we had those outreach activities as well, where we would have panel sessions in different specialty societies. Okay. Actually, could everyone introduce themselves very briefly before they give comments so that everyone knows who you are?
My name is Guy Gedden. I'm from Washington University. I work with Marcus Buehler on the IMU-Beam working group, and we want to actually give some examples. We also actually interact with David Eckman's working group as well, Tom Akilov's working groups. A lot of the issues that you raise are issues that the active working groups have faced and have addressed and are addressing. And it would be okay, I'd like to just very quickly give a few examples of how we face these issues. We've thought about these issues, and we're currently addressing them. And many of the ideas that have been raised here are actually already in place right now. That would be okay time to take us a couple minutes for Marcus to flip through a couple slides. And Marcus, would you? Oh, you're inviting me up.
Just
Marcus
is
inviting me up.
Guy. Couple of minutes.
Yeah. So we're going to have a couple of slides. I'm going to flip through.
Yep. So very quickly, our working group, we're hyperactive, we admit, but we have this specific mission of helping create tools to go across scales and integrate those with experiment. We've had our webinars. We've put together lots of special issues. We've started to move beyond those. We've found, as we've identified our common themes, that we've been able to do things, as Andrew was suggesting. We're putting together course materials. We have short courses right now. Marcus, say a few words about the short course he's put together.
Yeah, so we've been really seeing that education is a really important part of this, at different levels. So this is one we're teaching every year, really for anybody from graduate students, professionals, people not in the field, and trying to teach people within a week, like a boot camp style about multi-scale modeling simulation and how it is created with a combination with experiment. And it's been very successful to reaching broader communities beyond this particular insular community here.
So, and I just want to say a few words about impact. At first, Marcus's course has impact. There are politicians, FDA, high school kids, across levels, there's impact there. We've put together many special issues. There are lots of journals that are very interested in these topics out of these special issues, and also a couple of special issues that have come from David Eckman and Tom Akilov's group. We've identified a set of common themes, and these are all out of the last 2 years. These represent about 100 papers, and there's immense interest in technical societies and beyond this group. Journals are a great way to get the word out. We found this more effective than some of the webinars we've been having as well. We've been reaching out to lots of conferences. We had a symposia at these 2 conferences this year. One Marcus ran, one that I ran.
Yeah, so I think to this effect, I think was mentioned earlier that we should go to the professional societies or our home societies are sometimes, or we are involved in different things. We've done this, and we have found actually this to be really effective communicating. We've communicated what we're doing at IMAG and MSM at these places, ASME, the Multiscale Modeling Conferences, and many, many other places, and a couple of things in the works. So this really is important to go beyond this particular community. And there's a lot of new strengths and new tools we think we are getting into this working group from these events, and that's why our group has participation from many different places, really.
There's no shortage of people across technical societies who know how to pronounce IMUB. We've held workshops as well. So out of a lot of this work has come specific themes that actually do bridge working groups, and people across working groups are involved in these. One that's emerged really from inductive inference through the set of tools and media we put together is this concept of hidden time and length scales. And Marcus is putting together a special issue in a special journal whose editor is blurred out.
Right. The JBM we're doing, this is one of our latest projects we're trying to do. And here it's going to be a collection of perspective articles and maybe some that have multiple, large group of authors and technical articles. And this is going to be looking at hidden time and length scales. And, the way we've put together these special issues always is really bring together people from many different fields and trying to find common themes. And we always write, Guy and I have been writing editorials for these special issues to try to bring this together and tell a joint story. So if you're interested in participating in this, we can send an email to the list, actually. This call for the JBM special issue will be coming out very shortly, so we can send this to everyone.
Lots of IMUB workshops coming up, and just the last thing I want to mention is that we have been talking about this issue of impact. Impact in the sense of visible impact for the public. It's more important now than ever, as many people have mentioned, and we have a whole series of approaches that we're trying out this year. These are going to be small efforts, but we're trying to get into social media. We're trying to take some of the beautiful animations and apps that for multi-scale modeling that are on Marcus's website, make those available to high school students. And Marcus has a couple of ideas as well on top of this.
Yeah, I think the idea of reaching different communities, Manny really came from K-12, undergrad professionals. We've had ideas in the group yesterday. Actually, we discussed the idea of doing actually a master's degree, maybe partnering between different universities. And we have had MIT recently introduced the concept of micromasters, which is halfway done online. And if you take credit, you take classes for I think about half the year or so, 6 classes, and then you apply to MIT with those 6 classes. If you don't get admitted, you have no credit for those classes whatsoever. But if you're admitted, you get MIT credit for those classes you took. And so we had an idea yesterday, maybe between a couple of universities, to do something like a 1-year master's, 2-year master's degree, where we would have a joint set of courses, introductory courses, done online. And then you could apply to the schools. You could be admitted to any of the 2 or 3 or 4 universities participating in this consortium. And this would be a master's level, really training students in the kind of multi-scale tools we're talking about here. So this, I think, we thought in the discussion yesterday, actually, is really important, because if we do want to generate excitement and interest and maybe new generations of people thinking differently, and medical doctors thinking differently about this, these kind of degrees would be a great way of achieving this.
And then, very briefly, there are lots of opportunities to get involved in any of this across working groups. There's another version of Marcus's course happening this summer, very successful last summer. There's a high demand for it. It has to actually be capped. And there are a couple of new conferences that we're organizing, and those who want to get involved are invited to do so.
This is the main ASME meeting. So this is an example of both Guy and I involved in ASME and MRS and other societies. So we're organizing next year at the central ASME, this is the American Society of Mechanical Engineers Society meeting in the fall. Through the materials division, we're planning to organize an IMUB session, right? So this will bring together folks from ASME, and the idea we have to pitch there, actually, we think we could think about is thinking about standards and codes, because ASME's marketing slogan, I guess, on the website, the history really is about creating standards and codes, and so we think there's an opportunity for us to bring together the modeling, multi-scale modeling, the bio work we're doing, with this group that's been established for many, many decades in thinking about developing standards and codes. And we think there's an opportunity here in doing something in that space with ASME. I think that was it. So thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Marcus and Guy. I just want to break in. I want to just make sure Shane and Gianluca have time to introduce their new working group. So if you both can just stand at the mic so we know, we're going to have these 3 questions and comments, and then you two present your new working group proposals.
Back
All right. Could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Joy Koo from Stanford University. And I just wanted to echo the earlier comment about bringing in clinicians and biologists. And I think the idea of having panels at some of these types of professional societies and not just the mathematical and biophysical societies, I think is really important for the public outreach. Something else to think about that we've thought about also in terms of our particular simulation software is the idea of having some kind of matching program going on either at these conferences where you have clinicians or biologists who have specific problems that they think modeling might help with, but they don't know who to connect with to get those modeling or simulation work done. You might do that at a conference, or you might even think about having them come to IMAG MSM, reach out to them and have them present their problems and have them have a chance to establish some collaborations and partnerships.
Good suggestions, Joy. Any reactions from the committee?
I actually would like to follow up. How would we, and I'd like the clinicians in the room, if you can raise your hands, to offer suggestions on how we bring more clinicians to this meeting.
Am I the only clinician here? I don't think so.
I think there are others. Okay. Gary, you want?
I'm not going to answer that particular question, but I will get to it in a second. So my name is Gary Ahn from the Department of Surgery at the University of Chicago. And those of you who know me, I'm going to be out of my usual self and be controversial here and talk about what I think is a fundamental strategic pivot that we need to do. And this has to do with the fact that in order to engage someone, they need to feel that there's some incentive or some need that they need to have met. And I think the problem is that the larger biomedical research community is under the impression that they are actually doing a good job in finding solutions to treat clinical diseases. Clinicians don't know what the pipeline looks like because they only have the tools that they have available to them. But there's a belief that things are working okay in terms of identifying drug candidates, effectively controlling diseases like solid tumors for whom we haven't had a change in mortality stage by stage for 25 to 30 years, where the metric for success is 3 months of additional life. I mean, as a clinician, that's ridiculous. So I think what has happened is that every once in a while these fields do come around with certain existential questions for which we have ceded our authority or our ability to answer because we haven't taken those opportunities. So let me give you 2 examples that we've lost on and one that we have an opportunity for. The thing that we lost on is the translational dilemma, right? So there was existential crisis 15 years ago about the valley of death and what's the problem between translating basic science into effective clinical therapeutics. And we ceded that discussion to a great degree to the clinical operational research people, where they started talking about difficulties in getting the large enough clinical trials and being able to reify those particular populations and that kind of stuff, where we all know that there's a fundamental scientific problem in going from reductionist individual experiments to more explanatory multi-scale explanations. We've also ceded precision medicine to a certain degree to data scientists who have focused on narrowing the definition of what precision medicine is to essentially, at this day and age, specifically identifying molecular tumor subtypes for whom we can treat with combinations of drugs that we already have, right? So there's no component in that provides a tractable pathway or an enhanced pathway towards finding new particular drugs. We have ceded what precision medicine should be, which is the right drug for the right patient at the right time, which inherently involves state identification and dynamic understanding of how that system works, to people who are focused on combining pieces of information that are already out there. So I think the opportunity we have right now, is the hot topic, is the crisis of reproducibility. Right? That's been in the scientific community a lot recently. Now, what is that? Well, it means that you have experimental platforms that are so brittle that if you change the postdoc or the air filters in your lab, you can't reproduce your results. Now, how robust is the conclusion that comes out of that? Right? So there is a bigger scientific question about how we can actually bind together all these disparate types of experiments, which are done because that's how they have to be done. But math and computation is the way to tie those things together. I've mentioned this because this community should take the opportunity of striking when the iron is hot and putting out statements addressing those particular existential crises that represent needs within the general research and clinical community and say, hey, we have a solution to that. So when I talk to a basic scientist, they say, well, show me how this works. I hold up my cell phone. This is how it works, right? This is the product of science, simulation, math, and engineering. This is how it works. Now, we have not accepted that biology needs to be treated in that particular fashion because we have, quite frankly, a large infrastructure of research that is incentivized to demonstrate that they actually are doing a good job, right? Whereas we kind of know that there are insufficiencies from a scientific standpoint. As a clinician, I am extraordinarily frustrated with the toolbox that I have in treating patients, right? So to sum this up, I think that the short-term thing that we should do is come up with a position statement from this group with respect to how modeling and simulation at multiple scales can address the crisis of reproducibility that we see in multiple fields and in various aspects of biomedical research.
Thanks, Gary, for those comments. That actually ties in a little bit. I have a response, Grace, to your question. As an example, I've had discussions with some of the major clinical journals or health journals, and there are some stances that they don't publish models. They say, oh, we don't publish models, we publish clinical trials and things like that. So one possible option is to establish some clear position papers in some of those major journals, and tying in with what Gary said, actually tying it to some of these major questions that are plaguing clinical medicine right now. Because if we were to just publish, say, a paper on the benefits of multiscale modeling, that might not fly as much. But if we're saying that, here's the problem, here's the problem that we're facing in clinical medicine, and here is an option that can potentially address that, that might be more convincing to the clinical audience. The other option is to also go to some of these major medical society meetings and have panel discussions or presentations. And Terry, I think you have some suggestions too.
Yeah, I very much agree with the statements you made, and one of the ways in which I have seen this affect the practice of current medicine, and one of the things that I think this group could be particularly good at is what I could call the fight against the enemy of evidence-based medicine. Evidence-based medicine is a wonderful name for a statistical decision-making, which works wonderfully for populations, but very poorly at the level of individual patients. And when you're dealing with an individual patient, what you need to know is the link between the measurements you can make in that patient and the probable outcomes. Measurements are typically lab values or imaging or biopsy results, which could be argued as at one scale of the system, and the clinical outcome you're looking for is at a different scale. So the role of models is the role of explanatory thinking. It's the role of deductive logic as opposed to inductive logic, where you deduce from an understanding of the fundamental mechanisms and from a set of very focused measurements what's likely to happen in that particular individual. That's not to say that you don't use the statistical data that says that certain interventions are likely to have efficacy in certain situations, but I think it's recognizing that we are now so strongly biased towards statistical thinking in medicine that the role of deduction and understanding has been de-emphasized. And you see this in medical schools where the education is focused on memorization of the various acronyms of the clinical trials that are supposed to guide your thinking and your reasoning and your treatment of patients. So I think that there's a very big potential political fight that you could do, but it's quite an uphill battle because this is really quite pervasive within medicine right now.
So I'm writing the chapter on evidence-based medicine for the Sabiston surgical textbook, and the subtitle for that chapter is going to quote from The Princess Bride, which says, "You use that word a lot. I don't think it means what you think it means."
Any other reactions from the committee members?
Maybe just, of course, we want to promote the field, but we also don't think we want to appear overconfident. We have the model credibility plan sessions tomorrow, and I read one of the submissions that actually said all models are wrong. So this is something that we should keep in mind. We keep pushing the envelope. But of course, any model has assumptions, and we need to validate them and invest. While we definitely can offer many new opportunities and new approaches, we also, I don't think that we should come across as overconfident and overextend the message.
The other avenue is medical education. So currently, most medical schools don't have anything that resembles a modeling course. If you think about it, every business school program, you have to go through financial modeling, you have to go through Excel operations and those things. So at least some of the other degree programs have those aspects, but medical school doesn't. So if some of that exposure can be incorporated into the education, the early education process, that might also seed more interest as well.
I'm Dave Ekman from Penn. I'm a clinician, and I'll address Grace's question from earlier about how to get more clinicians in the room. And I think the way to get more clinicians for the room is for us to go out of the room and to the clinicians. That is, as we heard earlier, it's a matter of establishing need. From the cohort of clinicians that I interact with at Penn and at other institutions, I would say, for the most part, they don't know what they need. As Terry commented before, there's a lot of drive in medicine now for things to be protocol-based or evidence-based, or even for what we now call best practices. And if you already have best practices in medicine, it seems to me it goes good, better, best. So how do you improve on something that's already classified as best? I think the role of modeling for us, the role for us as modelers is to go out to the community, to integrate into societies. I think what Guy and Marcus presented earlier is a way that they interact that can really go to the industrial side of things. If we want to mimic that, then we have to go to the clinician side of things, which will be at small societies and at large societies. So we're talking about the American College of Surgeons and interactions with surgeons, which a person like Mark Garby has been doing very effectively. If we want to do that with cardiologists, then we need to be involved with the AHA or the American College of Cardiologists and so on and so forth. So for each of us who has a distinct area of medicine, whether it's a subspecialty like oncology or it's endocrinology and diabetology and so forth, we need to establish local clinical contacts and then use that to leverage into a more national kind of presence. I think once we do that, that will bring people into the room.
Good point, David. Any reactions? So we're starting to see some of those. Recently, I was part of a panel at AHA, the AHA meeting down at New Orleans this year, which focused on system science and system methods and approaches. So I think the appetite is slowly growing because people are hearing about this, and a lot of people are saying, oh, it's like any catchword. When they hear about the catchword, they're like, oh, system science, tell me a little more about that. And so we can capitalize on some of those opportunities. But David, those are good suggestions. Next come.
Ahmet Erdem at Cleveland Clinic, and also Committee on Credible Practice of Modeling and Simulation in Healthcare. And I hope everybody knows that that committee is part of IMAG MSM, by the way. And I would just like to tell what worked for us and what didn't, in the case of working groups, and maybe it will be a guidance, and maybe it can show an example of how we can unite under different topics. Now, I guess we were lucky to work on a problem that is broadly applicable to any modeling and simulation person. And that essentially helps us to bring in a lot of members, like, you know, clinicians, engineers, scientists, but also reach outside and connect to the, you know, different communities, like different societies, bring, you know, regulatory groups and, you know, bring like the designers and et cetera, like into that group too. And I guess like the things that really helped was having a, you know, a very structured approach to the organization of the committee, having an advisory council that provides feedback and having an executive committee actually that does a lot of the legwork, but more like the commitment of all the members to spend time on it. And that is actually rather difficult as we know, but if the members do not commit spending time on it, it's better they're not a member at all actually. And that actually like, you know, worked for us, and we were rather lucky in that part, and we had a nice critical mass of like people taking each other's slack to do that. And about outreach, I think we had a interesting grassroots approach to outreach, and I think that comes from credibility being a general purpose, you know, like general or broadly applicable problem that needs to be solved in any modeling and simulation, for any modeling and simulation tool or for any discipline. Like a lot of our members, like whenever they go to their own disciplines conferences, they also take a poster from the committee, make another poster for the committee and attach it there, or insert in their presentations maybe some like subtle way of like indicating credibility, talking about like how IMAG, MSM, and our committee is doing work in that. And maybe those kind of approaches like put some of the ideas to the communities that we want to reach, at least like insert the ideas there, and as we reach out further, it will not be a top-down approach. It will be a aha moment, and they will realize, oh, okay, that actually makes sense. Yep.
Good thoughts and good suggestions, reactions?
I have to vouch for what Ahmed said. I'm on the committee's list, and I get all their emails, and they really work well together in suggesting conferences to submit their posters, and then they edit the abstracts, and they edit the posters, and it's a really unified response of what they want to project out of their committee. So if the working groups want to think about focusing their deliverable for the year, that they want to address certain issues, that's a good way to model.
I think your working group was one of the official, most organized working groups.
It also aligns now with the funding requirements, which is the model credibility plan, and that's one of the ways that we can actually get a cross-fertilization, like with the investigators and outside groups that connects through this committee.
So I think we're going to now get to the talks of the two new working group proposals. So the idea is each will propose their working groups, and we'd really want to hear feedback from this audience and the steering committee on what they think about these new proposals. So John Lucas first.
Right, and I'll be very brief. There was not a lot of attendance for the medical device working group, and there is a lot of interest from people that email me and would like to be involved, and primarily because other working groups were in session and there were already commitments for that. But the gist, in my opinion, of the medical device working group is that this is an opportunity for this group, and again, this resonates with a lot of the things that have been said before, to have some sort of petting zoo, if you will. So it's really to bring something practical that other people that are not necessarily in this audience can understand. So something that results in the medical devices, I think will really give a very powerful springboard, something that everybody else that doesn't do modeling will understand. You know, from the business point of view, again, I wear two hats. I'm an academic at the University of Utah, but I'm also heavily involved in business. And I also teach in a business school as well. One of the quotes that comes to mind is the quote of Ben Franklin: if you would attempt to convince someone, you got to appeal to interest and not intellect. And I think if we can find a way to scratch the back of those that have an interest in the outcome of this model, I think really we have a very powerful way to become really much more relevant than we currently are. I am involved with several medical device companies. They're not here. They want to use our models. They do use our models. They support us, but they don't see yet a reason perhaps to come directly to these meetings. They contact directly the people that they're familiar with, for example. So I think that a working group like a medical device working group would put a lot of these things into context. It would help getting the word out to those that not necessarily use at this point or really interested in how these multiscale models come about. There are also initiatives that perhaps this group may be aware of. And in IEEE, we started an IEEE journal on multiscale and multiphysics computational methods. And the journal is active, is accepting papers, and has been active since about 8 months. There has to be some connection, that particular framework, with electrical or magnetic activities of some sort, besides other phenomena. But again, it's again another way to demonstrate that there is definitely interest out there, and other communities are latching on what this particular community can provide. My email, hopefully somewhere in the IMAG website. Feel free to contact me. I'll be happy also to establish other contacts with medical device companies or other entities that could be relevant and important for this community.
Or post your comments right here on the IMAG wiki.
Absolutely. Forgot that.
So if anyone can tell your reaction.
I will also be happy to answer.
So I think that's a great thing. Again, one of the issues that's going to happen here is that you already have so many different working groups. Nothing against having yet another one. I think this is very critical. And I think one of the great things that can do is to also interface with regulatory bodies and reimbursement bodies, the FDA and CMS, because that's where these models can be very helpful. And we had a little conversation. I was talking with Donald Lochner before about this whole idea, and similarly she was echoing that. You might want to comment. But certainly the ability to use models to speed up regulatory, to help with other things, to validate, to further reinforce what we see in the empirical observational domain, the clinical domain. If it looks like a duck and walks like a duck and smells like a duck is a duck, the more you have that goes to that may all help to make things go forward faster. So I think that could be very, very useful.
And actually, that's a great comment, because what you just brought out is precisely one of the reasons why, and those that are old enough, in the early 90s, if any of you remember the cell phones scare, we call it now, whatever that was. Anyway, everybody was trying to understand if cell phones in those days were a potential problem, inducing cancer and whatnot. And that was probably the very first application I remember, because I was involved. At that point, we had the 3mm head models, and we couldn't visualize them. Again, we're talking about early 90s. So the way we were visualizing them were printing layers, stack of layers with the printer, and then with the thumb, you flip the thumb, you see, real-time scroll of the device and the head model and everything else. So it was that long ago. And computational method, in that particular case, finite different time domain method, became an accepted computational method to certify cell phones. I mean, all your cell phones that induce less than 1.6 watts per kilogram and average of every 1 centimeter cube, 1 gram of tissue, most likely have been certified through a computational method, through a finite difference time domain method, as a matter of fact.
Other comments?
Yeah. So, first of all, congratulations. It's a great idea. But beyond that, you might want to interface with the other working groups, because medical devices will generate a lot of data for us to analyze. So maybe start from scratch when you actually know what data you're going to offer, or give some sort of classification of data that other working groups can use. This will be very helpful.
Absolutely. And actually, I think there is definitely a lot of overlap, perhaps synergy, that we'll have to consider, and perhaps merging. The translational working group comes to mind. Of course, I haven't interfaced yet with them, but of course, a lot of data clearly is an important aspect. And just about a lot of working group can contribute a great deal of science, a great deal of knowledge. And again, the way I thought of it is what I was saying at the beginning, the medical device device working group can really provide that petting zoo, the thing that everyone can touch. This method resulted in this piece that ended up into this patient. So it's really the giving that a particular powerful message to perhaps legislation as well, or whoever, again, can see the result of this group from a higher point of view.
Okay. So that we can move on, but thank you for your, any concerns or immediate questions about the, this proposed working group? Okay, why don't we move on to our next proposal?
Hi, everybody. I'm Shane Pierce Kotler at the University of Virginia, and I am proposing a new working group in collaboration with the co-PI Sylvia Blemker, who's on the steering committee. This is a working group that we came up with a few years ago when we sat down to write our UO1 application. We noticed that almost all of the existing working groups are really inward-facing for IMAG and MSM, and so we wanted to propose something that was a little more outward-facing. And so we've titled it Dissemination, Outreach, and Education, and it's really, I'll read you our mission statement, to promote and expand MSM community by increasing communication with and providing resources for stakeholders who are currently outside the community through marketing, outreach, and educational activities. And we've defined stakeholders in the broadest sense. This includes policymakers, doctors, patients, obviously the non-modeling scientific community, K through 12 students and teachers, and anyone else we feel that can benefit from using our tools and techniques. So a lot of what we sort of talked about, and we got some really great ideas in our first meeting yesterday. There were about 9 people there, but things like publicizing our successes through YouTube, and we appreciate the existing YouTube channel that we might be able to leverage to post additional short videos, or we talked about the 3-minute theses as well as posting different educational material that we can use to reach into the K through 12 sector, things that are activities, toy models, press releases, REUs, RETs, a lot of activities that most of us are participating in anyway, but giving a public face to that and sort of one-stop shopping for people who are interested in accessing those resources. We also thought this would be a really great opportunity to engage our own trainees, postdocs, and graduate students. Typically are really excited about these sort of outreach activities and benefit a lot from engaging in them. And so that's kind of the general gist, and I think based on the conversation that we've just had, it might be a good service to some of the other working groups to have collaboration or a central place to go to organize some of the great activities and ideas that have been talked about already.
Thank you, Shane. Well, this is very much in line with some of the earlier discussion about our from our steering committee. Sylvia, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, just to tie it in with the comment before about purpose-oriented working groups, and this is clearly one of the purposes that we've identified that all working groups should be able to take advantage of.
Not too much to add. Shane gave a great introduction to it, but yeah, we just both feel strongly that it's important for us to reach out to the broader community and have an impact that way. I guess, I don't know if you said it in there, but one thing that we're kind of deciding is the venue. The YouTube channel is obviously one way that we can get things out, but having a web presence, and I think we all agree that the wiki is more of an inward-facing thing. So the question is, okay, what would be the web presence, the outward-facing web presence, which I don't know if people in the room have some comments about that, but we have Joy Koo here who's going to talk about SimTK, which could be an option for that.
Any other comments from the committee?
Not too much. I think it's a great idea. I just think far too few people know what we're doing here. And it's a conference that people come back to every year because they either get funded or they've been here before. And so I think to expand the impact of what we're doing, it's critical that we go outside. So it's a great idea.
Any other general comments?
Yeah, Bruce and the room. I think if this working group comes into being,
it could pair very effectively with the clinical and translational working group, and especially for outreach activities where their focus on outreach and education is a little different from what the clinical and translational focus is. But many of the methodologies and the tools and the expertise and so forth that can be delivered could be transitioned to the clinical side of things or the industrial side of things, as well as their target audience. So I think it has great potential to be highly collaborative with other working groups.
Good point, David. So this is in many ways an overarching working group that's going to or has to interact with many of the other working groups.
Absolutely.
Any other comments, suggestions? Danny?
Just a quick one regarding webinars that are more tutorial-based. So this is also a tool for encouraging recruitment of graduate students who are involved in the scale modeling research, and also in that in any type of working group activity, because they will need to master certain tools or be exposed to new approaches. And in that, it should be encouraged that we should tell our students to attend this webinar.
All right. Any concerns or questions about this working group?
I just have a suggestion.
Okay.
If you're planning on to reach out to also students and younger generation, what I would recommend is, in addition to having a web presence, you should consider using social media a little more aggressively.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. We were talking about social media, and I think, again, that's another excuse to invite our own trainees to facilitate, because they're usually doing a lot more of that than some of us older people. So yeah, I appreciate that comment, and I think that would be a great idea.
Okay. Any other comments about this second proposed working group? All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. This was a great discussion. So I'm going to ask Joy Koo to come up and present SimTK as a possible platform to help with our communication.
Thank you all for having me here today to tell you more about SimTK. For those of you who aren't familiar with SimTK, this is a resource that was started up in 2005 by one of the National Centers for Biomedical Computing called SimBios. And it's a repository that makes it easy to share digital assets. You're talking about models or code or just any kind of electronic file, as well as to make it easy to collaborate on these different projects. We worked closely with users in the biosimulation community to develop and continue to develop the site, and we now have about 53,000 members on the site and 800 plus projects. So SimTK is based around the idea of projects, and as you can see here, here are a bunch of neat projects that are on the site. Each of these is owned and managed independently. And each project has team members associated with it. The project administrator has very fine-grained control over the permissions for each of those members, as well as for public. So they determine who gets access to what parts of the project. You also get access to many tools for sharing and building community. So I don't have time to go through all the different features on the site, and I'm just going to focus on a few of them that I think are most relevant for the working groups. Each project has an overview page, so basic description about the project, who is involved with the project. And then we have a whole set of what I call dissemination type of features. So we make it easy for you to upload different files and documents, source code, as well as make it easy for others to download those. There's a dedicated area for any kind of publications related to the projects. We provide statistics on who's coming to the site, what resources are being used, how are they being used. And most recently, we've started to connect SimTK to other web applications that are out there. For instance, the NIH Big Data to Knowledge Initiative has a resource called DataMed. So this is they're trying to index all the digital resources that are out on the web and put it into this one directory. So we are working with them to make sure that all the SimTK resources show up in DataMed. So you can think of SimTK kind of as a one-stop dissemination effort. You put your resources on SimTK, and we're going to push it out to all the relevant other websites that are out there. We also have a whole host of different communication types of tools. So different groups have different ways that they like to communicate. We provide discussion forums. You have a wiki. You could do mailing lists. You could just post news items. We also have a follower feature, so you could have people who are connected to the community, they're following the project, but they're not actually getting access to different parts of the project. They just get updates on what the group is doing. So to tie all these projects together, because they are independently managed on the site, but to bring them all together, we've established communities. This is a snapshot of the shoulder modeling community, and it's a collection of the projects on SimTK that are related or align themselves with shoulder modeling. And what's nice about it is you get a snapshot of what's going on across these projects. So the news, the publications, latest discussions that are happening within these projects all show up in this one page. So one way you could envision using this for the working groups is that each working group might have a project. And then you could have an IMAG MSM community, and so all the information that gets posted for the individual working groups gets automatically collated into this one page. So SimTK provides a lot of great infrastructure for the various projects. Some of the projects, though, want their own brand. They want their own look and feel. And so they've come up with a hybrid solution that works for them. This is an example of the SimVascular cardiovascular modeling project. And they have their own website, which I show in the background there, that has their own look and feel to it. But then they have a lot of links on the site that link out and use the infrastructure provided by SimTK. So for instance, for their downloads, for their discussion forums, when someone clicks on the SimVascular website, it actually goes to the SimTK project for SimVascular. So the best way, though, to really get a feel for what SimTK can and cannot do is to actually try it out yourself. The website is simtk.org, and there are actually several working groups that already have projects on SimTK. The Credible Practice of Modeling and Simulation in Healthcare has a site there. And then also the Population Modeling Working Group is using the mailing list that we provide through SimTK. I've also set up a demo working group project that you can go and try out. What I did was I took the biomechanics working group and the content on the current wiki site and ported some of it over into this SimTK project. So you can take a look at it. It's simtk.org/project/joytest. Log in as either guest 1, 2, or 3 using the password MSM10years. And that will give you administrative privileges for that project. So you can go and turn on different features. This is what it looks like. You can go under here. You can edit the project info, add different people as members, play around with the various features and get a feel for what a project actually can enable. Lastly, I did set up an IMAG MSM community just to give you a sense of what that would look like. And so right now I put in the demo project as well as the CPMS project here, and it's pulling in information from these two different projects to show here. Lastly, if you want to get more information, it has a poster on democratization of modeling and simulation in biomechanics that explains how you can use SimTK to enable that. Welcome any feedback and questions. I'm here through the rest of the meeting. We're always looking to improve the site and make it more useful. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge the support of the NIH in developing and maintaining this site.
Thank you, Joy. Any comments for Joy?
Any limitations on what can be uploaded, animations or anything?
There's a limit on file size, just in terms of, I forget, it's something like, I think, 250 megabytes that we limit in file size. That's kind of it. We have connections to GitHub or a repository that you can use. Right now, we haven't needed to put a whole lot of restrictions because most of the files have been source code, which are relatively small. As we talk about looking at data sets and other larger files, we may need to revisit our policy. You can put anything you like up there, and we, as long as it's all HIPAA compliant. And we leave it to the user to assess the quality. There are a couple mechanisms that we do put in place to, like statistics, to help people assess what is the value of this. For instance, you can look at the number of people who are downloading it. You can look at who put it up. Your name's kind of behind that data or the resource you put up there. We provide some information about the last time it was updated to give you a sense of, is this really old code or is it something that's being actively maintained?
Joy, can you repeat the question for the WebEx people?
Sure. The question is, in terms of the previous discussion about reproducibility, how might this facilitate reproducibility? So actually, we have a project going on with Amit right now where we've provided, we're testing out cloud computing capabilities where you might take a model or software piece or a published result and put that up there so that someone could actually click through, maybe change a few parameters and test out and reproduce those results. But that's in the beta stage right now. We'd love to get more feedback about how that might be done, because reproducibility, our first goal was really just to get people to share. But now we're at a point where we've got a decent collection of projects, and the question of how do you then pick through that collection of resources to figure out what's really valuable, we're starting to address that now. So if you have thoughts, we'd love to experiment and try out new things on the site.
As a user of SimTK, so the Committee on Credible Practice of Modeling Simulation, as she highlighted, actually uses SimTK, and a lot of the top issues that were discussed earlier regarding, outward-looking communication across the working group and really reaching out to other communities as well. I've personally found that SimTK has really empowered us to actually achieve a lot of those goals and to be very transparent. The forum that's actually provided on there also is a great avenue to create, unique discussion topics that within your committee and as well as external community that want to contribute to that conversation can also do that using the forum. And there are a bunch of other tools that are actually available on there where you can really use the website for idea generation and pushing out a lot of content very quickly. So from that standpoint, I would say that the SimTK platform has been extremely powerful, and one of the things that's been stressed at this meeting so far is credible practice, and a lot of the tools that are necessary to actually achieve some of the expectations, such as version control. The SimTK platform also offers those services free of charge. So I would encourage as many of you as possible to at least try it out. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thanks, Alan.
Hi, this is Raj Vadgepalli from Thomas Jefferson University. One thing I want to bring up was, as you talk about democratization, the side effect seems to be fractionation. Seems to be doing same thing many times by different people over time. For example, the cloud computing thing that you talked about, I mean, probably not the one. There are many out there already. As a simple example, run my code. right? The Journal of Computational Science uses it. The virtual physiological human people coordinate with it. So why not just put the shoulder to the wheel on something like virtual physiological human is already aligned to the way we think, right? Why should we fractionate like this? I'm sure there is value in doing something here, but what is the unique value proposition to do it through this, for example? And this is just a more principle about it rather than a specific, SIMTK specific question. I'm sure Ahmed has something to say.
I think you're right. I think part of it is that this site started up 12 years ago. So 12 years was before Facebook, before Dropbox, before any of this happened. And so one of the things that I mentioned is that we are now, in the interest of kind of most efficiently using our resources, trying to connect to existing web apps that are out there that have much more dedicated resources for doing things like the cloud simulation or for, file sharing, GitHub. We're not going to recreate GitHub. We're going to leverage what they do. And so we're looking at SIMTK as kind of leveraging those resources and the other existing efforts that are out there as much as possible. What SIMTK brings, though, is the community. So we have people who are very focused on biosimulation, that are providing resources that make it easier to find people with similar ways of thinking, similar relevant resources. Does that address your question?
Yeah, partly. I mean, there is an issue of what kinds of resources are best to use out there if you want to share, right? Even is SIMTK going to be providing guidance? I mean, I'm on the credible practice thing and I should know better than this, but my question is it a specifically stated public goal that if someone is looking for modeling, sharing resource, or how do you let other people reproduce what I do? What is the best practice for my sub-field, so to speak? Is SIMTK going to be providing guidance for that? Is it a one-stop shop to ask that question in the community, or is that going to be yet another one of 100 that I should be hooked up with to know the answers? You see what I mean?
So I think that there are a number of resources out there to fulfill some of the guidelines that the CPMS committee is putting out. So in terms of repositories, you could put it into GitHub. That's a very fine way of doing version control. You could also use, if you started your code a while ago before GitHub came about, you might have your code in a Subversion repository and you don't want to move it. I think that's the guidelines, they're guidelines. And I think there are multiple ways that you could fulfill those guidelines. It's not necessarily that SIMTK is the only way.
I just want to follow up that question and just to give examples of how you can use. I think the one good aspect of SIMTK that provides me as an investigator that want to keep an eye on my models, data, disseminate publications, it's a kind of one-stop shop. And it has a lot of features, and you don't need to use all those features. You can turn some off, some on. And because as I see, if I publish a model and if I want to disseminate that model for reproducibility or for just repeating, one option that I have is to submit to a journal site as supplementary material. But I need to be smart about the maintenance of that model like 10 years later too. What's going to happen to that? Or if I'm doing like all different kinds of models, submitting to a lot of different journals, and then I'm essentially lost, where I can actually centralize that process by systems like this, where it really provides a choice and empowers the project administrators and the project users.
So this is kind of the project-specific aspect. It seems like this could be a great tool for the projects that are in this consortium, the funded projects, because we're all asked, in the last 5 years, how you're going to disseminate, how you're going to, and so, I have my own website on my research page where I dump code, and it just sits there, I'm sure. So this sounds like a mechanism that, at a minimum, would be very valuable for us to consider having the UO1 projects in the consortium have project pages. But if I look at the wiki, I don't know how many times I like bothered Grace, like, how do you do X on the wiki? And I'm not entirely stupid, I'm not entirely brilliant either, but, you know, and that tool is onerous to use, and, you know, I think, you know, some of the questions are being asked, like, is this the best tool for dissemination? That's kind of not a fair comparison, because the IMAG wiki is not for dissemination, it's for internal use. So, I mean, one aspect, is this a good tool for us to use internally? And then a different, maybe, discussion is this a great tool for us to disseminate information to the public? But, you know, to me, how much worse could it be? You know, no offense to the IMAG wiki, but it's just really hard to use. And so I would advocate that we should be in a position to at least try something new for internal use. You know, again, the external dissemination of materials may be a little bit different issue.
So, Mike, that was a great segue, because we actually have Lisa Hamilton here, who is one of the constructors of the IMAG wiki, and I invited her here, and she's willing to go up on the stage. I have to first of all thank her and her team. They are a very new team at the NIH, and thank you, Joy, for, if you can stay up on the stage too, because it's a general discussion about usability and communication. So the whole idea, if you all remember from last year's survey of the consortium, was that people wanted a better way to communicate. We're having issues with the IMAG wiki, and so the idea was, should we consider SimTK as an alternative or as a supplement? Lisa and her team just recently joined within months, so the IMAG wiki was already up, so I shouldn't say that she's the creator of it, but she actually helped facilitate a lot of the functions that we have for the conference today. And so Lisa's here to answer any questions or receive comments about the IMAG wiki. And before too many people walk out the door, we are going to have a picture in this room, so if you guys can stay put just a little bit longer until this discussion is over. So I'm just going to open the floor to discussions about the communication process in general. The steering committee had decided that we would first discuss what kinds of deliverables this consortium would like to have first, before talking about the process of communicating the action of making the deliverables happen. So I think, Raj, you sort of went in between in terms of the philosophy of the platform and to communicate, and now we're at the point of the usability of how we want to communicate. And do we have, well, presumably we will, after this discussion, have the deliverables to work on. Now, if we were going to work on maybe some of these projects that you guys talked about, like curriculum development or tutorials, you know, do we go through and continue working on the wiki, or do we adopt some of the SimTK efforts? And so this discussion for the next 2 or 3 minutes is going to be on this topic.
Hi, I just want to briefly introduce myself. My name is Lisa Hamilton, and as Grace said earlier, I recently joined the NIBIB team back in January. I feel a lot of kind of the same concerns that I think many of you probably already have with IMAG Wiki. It's built upon a Drupal 7 platform, and I don't know if many of you are familiar with that, but those that interface with IMAG Wiki, you are now, has limitations for usability. It's been my plan and my intention to upgrade the platform to Drupal 8 and then work with Grace and other members of the community to take back user feedback, do some UX design, and put on this development schedule to update the IMAG Wiki. But that was before I learned about Joy's product, SimTK. I'm sorry, your work with SimTK, not your product. My apologies. And I've taken a deep look at it. I actually accessed it, on multiple devices because I'm responsive first, you design for mobile first. And I thought it was a very powerful resource. But there's still this IMAG Wiki that we have in existence, and my job with NIBIB is to service your community's needs. And so I'd love to hear your feedback. You probably have some of the same concerns that I do have with it, and I want to be able to create a product that can work for you, but also I don't want to be a block to something that could actually really perform some of the needs that you need now, rather than have you guys wait a year.
So first, I'd like to say thanks. The IMAG Wiki was really a great tool when it came out. It was the right tool for that time. and one of the nice things about a WordPress based system like Joyce has there is that I can have the whole IMUBeam IMAG wiki moved over to that in 7 minutes. So 1 minute to log on, 1 minute to log off and check, 5 minutes to move it. Not a problem at all. So moving platforms isn't a problem. My question is the types of things that my working group wants to do. We tweet. Marcus Bueller is second to Donald Trump in terms of followers in America, and they're different followers. It's amazing, so with your WordPress site, no problem. You can put in a Twitter tab, but we also do Instagram. We have beautiful images. Marcus produces some beautiful images, so we want to serve those. Then we have simulation. So there are very small JavaScripts. Marcus has some on his website right now. We should have shown some earlier. They're really compelling for the general public. And then the final thing is that we want an identity. So what we'd probably do is just reserve imubeam.org or imagmsm.org, and then have that direct onto your site. So my questions are: do you guys have the server resources for that? If we were to start upping your traffic by say 50 gigabytes a month, then also be accessing your site through a proxy, so that nobody really knows we're at the SimTK site. We were just going to they just go to imubeam.org and then just start getting stuff off your site. Is that the sort of thing you're ready for, or do we need NIH to actually be mirroring your site to allow those capabilities?
So in terms of adding some of those features, be straightforward. We actually had a user just ask us 2 days ago to link to their Facebook and Twitter, and so we're in the process of putting that on right now. Upping the traffic by whatever amount I forget you said, but
50 gigs is what we expect.
We're well equipped at this point to handle several orders of magnitude order in terms of traffic. That's not an issue at all. In terms of, I'm forgetting your last question.
We want to maintain the identity of the working group. So what we do is we'd use a proxy. We'd go to namecheap.org and get imubeam.org, and then have that redirect to your site.
That would be fine too. I mean, you can redirect to the site. That's not an issue. I mean, we're well equipped for handling a lot of traffic.
Thank you.
Can I sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just looking at the SimTK website. It seems as if there's some very specific categories of simulations on there, right? So biomechanical simulation, molecular modeling simulation, vascular simulation. But it seems like it's a very small number. Like it seems as if there are sort of toolkits on here for 4 or 5 things. But we're talking about a much broader range of potential models. I'm just wondering, obviously you could upload anything to this, but you have a competition problem in the sense that other fields are going to have their particular models and their particular websites and the places they access. How would you be able to get one site, whether it's SimTK or others, to try to get models of multiple different types? And these models of multiple different types could be agricultural models, it could be psychology models. I mean, there's many different things that I suspect somebody in those fields would not feel comfortable when they look at your examples of featured models that this website was a representative for them.
Right. So as I mentioned, SimTK evolved out of the National Center for Biomedical Computing, and the initial ones were our initial driving biological problems. What we've encouraged people to do is put in keywords, and as there are enough projects that fall into a particular category, we will update those categories. And with machine learning and whatnot in the future, we could probably just do that automatically. In terms of the other sites that are out there, where there is a lot of competition, I think each one kind of represents their own little community. One thing that we've seen some of the projects on our site do is they make a placeholder project. So it actually becomes, here's our project, here how it fits into all the categories and links to the different communities that are on SimTK. But then within their description, they say, go here to see other information, or even to direct to their own website. So in some ways it could be a directory in some sense, rather than a place where people actually store the resources. And I think in terms of kind of pulling in all the information that's out there and all the resources, that's the effort that the Big Data to Knowledge initiative under the NIH is trying to do. I guess that's still a little bit more medically focused, but they're trying to figure out a way that you can index all of these and have some crawler go out and automatically pull them into an index. So people go to there and then they see kind of here's the broad range of models and simulations and resources and data that's out on the web.
So, out here, back, still Raj again. As you talk about usability, accessibility, and so on, I see it more as fundamentally all these are wrapped up in utility, yeah? And I'd like to draw a parallel with you brought up BD2K, the data deluge, so to speak, for the last decade and a half, where at this point the databases of bioinformatics data and what have you, they're growing faster than you can say Wilcoxon rank-sum test. Whoop, they went up by a terabyte already in that second, yeah? So that's the rate at which they're going, which means that we are able to populate them and make them accessible and usable and annotated faster than you can actually derive value out of them. I wonder if, even if it's unintended, if it's a measure of our success here would be to get to a point where these modeling resources are getting populated faster than you can say global parametric sensitivity analysis, if you will. Oops, 100 more models in the database, yeah? So is that something to worry about? Are we in the early stages of it where we are enabling the democratization, if you will? Is that something to guard for, or do we welcome it? In terms of utility versus usability, I think there's a distinction to be made there.
Could you rephrase your question? So are you...
The fact that there are 10,000 models available, let's say, on this resource, what does that mean versus there are only 100? Or is the scale not the right way to look at it? What is the right way to look at it? The data people have formulated it as, look at how many petabytes we grow every year. That's some measure of success of some kind, yeah? What is it for us here?
So I think it goes back to one of the earlier questions in terms of when you have a lot of models out there, then it becomes a question of how do you figure out which ones to use. So one measure of success is just how many models. People are generating models all the time, and a fraction of those are going to be really helpful and reusable and valuable. So at the first stage, we just want to get people to get their models off their hard drive and into a place where other people can access it. That's step one. The next step is once you have these models out there, then you have to help people assess, and this kind of goes back to some of the efforts in the Credible Practice group, is then you have to get people to figure out which of these models is going to be useful for their particular use case. And there are different measures that you could talk about to try to help assess that. And so I think there's the number of models, but then also the other metric is how many of them are actually getting reused. So you could talk about, here's a model, here's the citation, the publication for that model. Then looking at the publications for that model, how many times does it get cited? Is it cited because it's an example of models in general? Is it getting cited because it's actually getting reused and be used in a clinical practice? I think that's where your success metric comes from.
Okay, I think we will end there. Raj, thank you for your very philosophical questions, and I want to thank Joy for the presentation, and Lisa for being here. If you guys can approach both of them with your feedback, that would be great, so we can continue and decide what we should do in this matter. I just have one more question, and it's my usual question for the consortium, is about next year's meeting. So I have just a couple of questions, and please don't leave the room just yet. We're setting up for photography shots right after these two questions are answered, so if you don't mind. The question is for next year's meeting. Is this time a better time frame to have this consortium meeting in March timeframe. Yes? Okay. And is this venue a better venue compared to Lister Hill? And so we will stay here, and we will have it around the springtime, and that's all I wanted to know.